I gotta say,
Yep, recording in progress.
Yeah, it gave me a notification.
Yeah, this is the only way I figured how I can actually record these for YouTube is to do Zoom.
Hell yeah.
yeah, I would say that that's definitely a big step in getting your podcast off the ground and whatnot. Like that, and then the other thing is probably like using keywords because I don't know, whatever, click
No.
stuff like
No,
that.
I mean this is like what the second year I've been doing this, second, third year.
Yeah. Well, the quality of the podcast has increased quite a lot, so gotta say, good job on that.
Well, yeah, I mean it's just been an experiment. I don't expect to be like any big podcaster or anything like that. It's just I was bored.
Yeah.
I actually had some friends. You probably know a few of them in Elko, Marino, Mangold, and Hunter Smith. They worked with me at the Home Depot, but they did a podcast and I listened to it and was like, if they can do it, I can do it. So I just figured I'd give it a shot.
Yeah. I haven't ran into them at all.
Okay. So,
dude, it's crazy to see Jonathan because I just know him from, well, I mean, I know what he looks like, but we spent many hours wasting our lives on PUBG together.
Yeah.
So,
good times.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I guess, yeah.
No, I was just gonna ask. So, what? Because it's kind of interesting. Because Jonathan, you actually hit me up with a friend request because we have a mutual friend. I think that's Jordan, if I'm not mistaken. Jordan Christian.
It's Harley Fretwell.
Harley Fretwell. Okay. So
yeah, and I realized I saw your comment on one of his posts. I was like, this dude's into Jordan Peterson. I'm into Jordan Peterson, and like, I just identified the keywords, I would say, but like over time I've sort of like moved to a more moderate view, I would say, of things. But I don't know, I'm curious, like one of the things I was wanting to talk about perhaps is whether or not metaphorical truth should be subject to truth or whatever definition you want to use, or if it should be the opposite way around, like that the real truth is subject to metaphorical truth. Sorry, yeah, that's correct. That's the correct way of saying it. So anyways, if with that tangent, do you want to get into that topic or what?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so for me, metaphorical truth is useful, especially with what I do with psychotherapy, counseling, and psychology. When you're trying to help people, who have problems with their lives, they're not going very well. I mean, I work with a really special population of severe and chronic mental illness, and so for them, sometimes the concrete, objective, scientific truth doesn't meet them where they're at. But if you can find a way, like with metaphorical truth, it kind of gets it there to where they can kind of understand the concepts of the things that they need to change, kind of thing. And so I think the metaphorical truth there is useful in that regard. And I think it's also very useful when you're trying to relay very complex and convoluted information to somebody more along more of the general layman term, if that makes sense.
So can I perhaps get like a example of this? Like, I'm not quite, like, I get what you're saying, but I'm not exactly sure how you apply that, like, or how exactly that fits.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that you find rigid totalitarian thinking along people with personality disorders and personality pathology.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I've done is, when it comes to that viewpoint is, of course, I go a lot with different metaphors, or you could say.
Sorry, I'm trying to get this right. My sincerest apologies. There we go.
It's okay. but I relay it through story. So like for example, when we were discussing like certain like borderline personality disorders, very it there's a rigidness there that it's like that person's viewpoint is very, it's black and it's white, so it's and it flips between ideation because or idealization, let's say. So one of the characteristics of borderline personality disorder is a intense pendulum swinging back and forth between I love you, I hate you kind of thing. And if the person's partner does not go along with what the person thinks they should do, then that person's emotions get extremely dysregulated, and their anger, rage, and all of that, it's very disproportionate, inappropriate to the stimulus. And it's predicated in that totalitarian viewpoint of, this is the way things ought to be, and anything that moves outside of the boundary is going to cause emotional dysregulation. And so from a metaphorical standpoint, it's like, well, you could think of the character of Satan in Paradise Lost. And so that's what I've gone with is, he had this totalitarian presupposition that he knew everything and everything had to work within the bounds of that. And anything that moved outside of that, and that was, of course, the idea that he had to be subordinate to human beings because, God elevated human beings, as far as his favorite creation, let's say. Well, that automatically, Lucifer automatically occupied a space of, well, that flies in the face of everything that he believed, and so that was his motivations for rebellion, and that's what, of course, set off the series of events in the book that led to his fall from heaven into hell kind of thing. And so that's one way I've relayed that. And
okay, so sorry. So I'm trying to fit together what that is. So talking to somebody with borderline personality disorder, it's very black and white. And you're trying to relate like their behavior to that of, like, say, the metaphorical, like Satan, and how it's black and white.
The certain patterns of thinking lead to certain patterns of behavior, and you could think of it as that this pattern of thinking and behavior probably dates back before modern clinical psychology and before personality pathology was ever like categorized and say from a clinical perspective. And so these what would you say, the fictional characters that relay these patterns out, that's one way of describing these things. Think of it like another good example. Well, yeah, I mean, we can take the idea of God, for example, the ideal mode of being, that's you could say that's an idea. The way I think of God from a psychological perspective is like a collective superego. If you look at Freud's idea of like the superego, the ego, and the id, and the superego, of course, represents the rules of society, the rules that are taught by your parents. So it's that superordinate moral principle that is internalized. It's like a mixture of the internalization of those rules that guide your morality, that acts as the mediator between you and, say, your instincts or inner desires. That's the superego mediates between the ego and the id. And so if you think of that from a collective standpoint of what's the collective ideal mode of being that you could act out that would work well for you and everybody else around you, you can think of it that way. If that makes sense. I'm still trying to sort all this thing out in a way that's less complicated than the way Jordan's put it out there.
Yeah. Let me see if I can put that together. Sorry. I'm not normally used to, like, I don't know, talking on podcasts, like,
take your time.
So I brought Caleb along. Yeah, and that's why I brought Caleb along in part, is because, like, I don't necessarily know how to deal with this. But okay, so when dealing with metaphorical truth, like, I'm not necessarily seeing any clear like examples of where the metaphor is more clear than say like a similar like description, or instead, well, how about I'm not seeing a clear example of where the metaphor needs to be taken as more than a metaphor. Now, naturally, when dealing with metaphors, you're talking about an amalgamation of a bunch of different like systems and like interactions that people have, and like the metaphors are definitely useful, and they're also true to some extent, but they're like representing the real world in a sense. Like I'm not seeing where the metaphor it should be considered as dominant to the real truth that underlies it, if you know what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, you can correct me where I'm wrong. But it seems to me the way you're thinking about this is that the metaphorical truth is what buttresses, say, the metaphysical truth, the real truth, the objective truth. That there's the objective truth, and that metaphor.
Real quick. I think I know what that buttresses means. Like I don't know the.
It supports it. It supports it.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah,
okay, that makes sense. So I don't know. So continue with your explanation, please. Like you're talking about metaphorical truth buttressing the metaphysical and something else. So
yeah,
like I don't know.
Yeah, to me, the metaphorical truth is a way of relaying something that's metaphysical, and yet it might be more, because there are things that are really complicated when you're trying to explain them. So if they're trying to break it down to somebody's level to where they can understand it, the metaphorical truths become useful into that. It's a distillation of the information. So, like for example, if you're talking to somebody and you ask them about their morning routine, they're going to give you the gist, right? You're not going to hear, well, first I woke up and opened my eyes, and then I took the blankets off, and then I did this, and this, and this, and they rattle off every single part of their morning routine. You don't want to hear that. So you want the distillation. Yeah. But even the distillation of something, like especially if you're trying to explain like behavioral patterns or anything like that, like that's how I think of the archetypes in a sense. It is, and so that's where the metaphorical truth kind of really helps with like bringing the archetype, or at least the pattern. That's, what would you say? The pattern that's related to the archetype in a way that you can relate that. So, for example, so here's a perfect example. When we once had a patient who had borderline personality, intermittent explosive personality, and a few other things. So he was an archetypal trickster in a sense, because there was some antisocial behaviors that were present, but the way that he acted out was like a trickster, not so much like the court jester, but more like say Eris, the goddess of chaos and discord, because for him, if he was bored and there was nothing to do, he would go and start trouble with the other patients to get them fighting for his own amusement. And then he would, of course, remove himself from the situation just to sit there and watch it all play out, which is, you've got chaos going on with like two patients trying to fight each other, or a patient going after him. And then you have us who are working on the floor, because I was a tech at the time. This was before I went to the psychology department. And then, having to break it up and everything else going on. And of course, then the nurses have to come out and, figure out what the hell's going on. And if people need a PRN injectable to get them to calm down, if they're not willing to self-regulate their emotions. Meanwhile, dude's sitting back in the corner, just entertained by all of this. And so in a sense, I said, you're like an archetypal trickster. Your behaviors that you're acting out, you're manipulating all these different actors in this environment just for your own amusement. And so when he was like, well, what do you mean by trickster? Because nobody had ever told him, it's not common vernacular in psychology. And it's like, well,
sort of like Loki, or I don't know, the joke. Well, I don't know if the Joker is necessarily.
The Joker's kind of an he's kind of an
metaphorical.
archetypal trickster in the sense that but he's more malevolent. I would say that he's
Yeah,
probably
more like a Satan. Yeah.
more of a Mephistophelian character, absolutely. Whereas this guy was, it wasn't malice insofar as he was hoping that people would get hurt. It was more like for his own amusement and entertainment in a sense.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's why I kind of more identified it with, say, Eris, the goddess of chaos and discord, because, when it comes to, like, say, aggression or any sort of, women tend to be more socially aggressive where men are more physically aggressive, and sometimes that social aggression is acted out through manipulation and things of that nature. And so that was the way. That's why I used the goddess of chaos and discord in that regard. And so I try to explain, acting out that archetype. What you're doing is you're acting out a pattern of behavior that is related to this character, that relates to an archetype, because it is a pattern of behavior that you can see repeated across time. That's what makes it archetype.
Yeah. Are you having any thoughts, Caleb? Because I'm like, I don't know.
As far as
any observations, like, I don't know, a little bit.
I mean, as far as just using metaphors and old stories to explain like the current situations in the world, I mean, I do that all the time, so I don't see any problem with that. Yeah, I really don't see any issue with it.
Like, to me,
I guess what is your specific reason for wanting to discuss this particular thing with metaphorical truths?
Okay, so the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I generally like Peterson. Well, I can't. There are a lot of things about Peterson that drive me a bit nuts. I would say he's very traditionalist, very what do you call it? Sort of like an old person.
He's a boomer. No, religious. I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying, but and that's fine. We can go into that, but what made you think about this particular thing? Is it the religious aspect, or
the reason why is because he makes this argument that truth is subject to metaphorical truth, or that somehow the metaphorical truth is, naturally you can make arguments that truth springs out of these truth springs out of non-truth processes, to some extent truth is, it's an outgrowth of metaphorical truth, and I just don't think that hypothesis is validated. And I think that in pretty much all cases that I found, not necessarily using, I have not found an instance where the metaphorical truth is actually dominant to truth in its utility to people. And I don't know, I think that hypothesis of Peterson's has not been validated, and that's one of the major gripes that I have with him, is that way of looking at things, because it's just I don't know, I'm a hard science person, and I think that's a fundamental part of Peterson's philosophy, and it does drive me a bit crazy, oh yeah, there's this metaphorical God, and but the thing is, that's you can believe that, but it's just that Peterson doesn't seem to act as if it's only metaphorical. It seems to what do you call it? He seems to believe that in some way the metaphor is the true part over the science, over the real, the more, what do you call it, straight facts of the universe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know what you're saying now. Sean, what do you think about that? Like,
Well, I think Brett Weinstein during the talks that he mediated with Sam and Jordan, I think he tried to validate that with the whole, acting as if a gun is loaded, right? The as if part.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is some utility in that, because if you always act as if a gun is loaded, then your risk of an accidental death, either by accidental suicide or accidentally shooting somebody else, is reduced drastically if you act as if the thing's loaded all the time, which means you're double, triple checking and make sure there's no rounds in the chamber. You're making sure that it's like I could hand you a gun and it's not loaded. But the first thing you're going to do is you're going to check it as if it's loaded. You're not going to just, carelessly point it at somebody or at yourself. You're going to check it as if it's loaded. So I would say that that's one good example of where the as if part is actually useful, because we could see objectively that a gun is not loaded. But I don't think we're going to take it for granted that it's not loaded, if that makes any sense.
And you could also say that if you make a habit of acting as if the gun isn't loaded, then one day you're going to pick up a gun where it is loaded and you're going to misuse it.
Yes.
So, like, do you have any other examples you want to put forward where the real truth is subject to the metaphorical truth? Like, or do you want me to address that one? Because I think that there's like a rational scientific way to deal with that example. And here, so I don't quite see, like, obviously there's a metaphor that like every gun is loaded, but then there's the fact that underneath that works almost just as well, that you should generally treat every gun as if it's loaded, because if you don't, then you might end up making a mistake, and so you're sort of like being statistical with it, which is a perfectly rational way to look at the world for the most part. And like that purpose doesn't exactly validate the whole claim that the metaphorical truth is, in terms of, like, I don't know.
I would say it's a good heuristic. It's a good mental shortcut. I think we could look at it in a matter of heuristics if we're going to take like shortcuts and mental processes. But I think Caleb wanted to say something, so I'm sorry I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
It's all right. I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm not sure exactly where we're going with this, but there are layers to this, like anything else. Like, we treat the gun like that, but we're not, like, let's say we had something like an acid that ate through your skin. We're gonna treat that more carefully than, like a fruit, like an acid from a fruit. Like, I guess I don't know. I understand what you're saying. I guess to a degree. I just don't know, like,
what the point of this is. And
I guess I don't understand the actual. That sounds mean on me. I just don't understand the point.
Yeah. Okay. So the way that, like, I don't see a world where we can, like, okay, so we know in a sense from the facts that there is no God, so to speak, in this hypothetical example. Like, there might even be a metaphorical reason for believing in a God, but I don't see how you can bridge the metaphor that we should believe this is absolutely true, and we shouldn't. And I don't see why Peterson can't answer, is there a God or not, like, in your theory, because it doesn't seem that, like, he rationally believes that there is a God. It's just that he also believes that the metaphors in some way, like, are real. But
okay, so
like, I don't get how he makes that bridge, and I don't see any rational justification to make that bridge.
So I agree with you. I think that Peterson functionally is an atheist. He doesn't believe in a supernatural, invisible entity that sees all. Yeah. Okay. As far as bridging the gap, I think that's where the wisdom in the biblical stories tends to come from, right? The different myths and how the myths tend to hold truths that are they're not true in the same way as scientific truth is, but they're still true. And one of the examples that I've heard Peterson use, so since we're going to we're on this, so we might as well just keep with it, is that, it's like Peterson was breaking down the flood myths, where he was talking about, in the stories, it's, well, humanity becomes corrupt, God's had enough of it, unleashes the rains and just floods everything out, except for like the few people that are supposed to repopulate the world. That's Noah and his family, and they have the ark and all of that. But when you look at okay, so what could be true about a flood myth? Well, he used, and I'm citing the Joe Rogan episode one of the Joe Rogan episodes that Peterson was on, where he says, well, let's look at Hurricane Katrina and the flooding that happened down in New Orleans. What caused the flooding? Was it God? No, it was human corruption, because they knew that, the systems that were in place to try to, prevent the flooding were not up to scratch, but the politicians and the people in charge of New Orleans that were supposed to be replacing these systems that were supposed to prevent the floods pocketed all the money. They never made the repairs that were necessary, and because of that, they got the big hurricane that came along, and then all that flooding happened. So in a sense, it's metaphorically true that human corruption typically tends to precede a major event like that. And so it's not a stretch that there's a moral to that story. And the moral is that you need to pay attention to the structures that you have that's set in place that are supposed to buttress you against, what they call acts of God, essentially, from an insurance perspective. They always say that, we cover against this and this and this, but we don't cover something else, which they just call an act of God, because it's something that's so statistically improbable to happen. But if it does happen, well, nobody can really predict it, kind of thing. So I would say that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just. Go ahead.
My bad. Okay, so my question with this is this is perhaps a useful question, but how do you tell between a true metaphorical truth and a false one? Like, how can you determine which of these myths have a good message and which of them have a bad message? Now, naturally, you could look at the ones like, I don't know, like if it's created by an ideology, that it's like false because it's not like coming from the unconscious, or like maybe that it's motivated by or hasn't been through the chopping block of thousands of years of culture, something like that. I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, do you have, I don't know.
I would say that most of the morals to these stories, they've been acted out over a period of time, and so the ones that people have paid attention to that's been beneficial, say from, of course, the Darwinian perspective, the idea that if you embody and act out certain patterns of behavior and they're more advantageous than they are deleterious, then those things are good metaphorical truths to keep. And if there are things that you tend to embody and act out and it ends up in your suffering or demise, and that's happened over thousands of years, and those are the bad metaphors. And I think that's the process that I would say that that's the process that has allowed, it's been interesting to me, because I've always been interested in like religious stories before I even got into psychology. And I was always thought of, it's always funny how all of the world's religions all share certain things that are universal across them. And I think that's what I would say that that's how that process has been kept, is because as religions have been around and have changed, and this is where like the friends of mine that are devout Christians, they're believers, where they get aggravated with me. It's just like you can look at all the different myths and that became religious or religions across human history, and certain ideas have transcended each new religion that has come across. And Peterson's talked about that to a degree, but I mean, if you look at the Marduk myth, the Egyptian mythology, you look at some of the base ideas in Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, all of it, and all of that, they do share these certain ideas that seem to have survived over thousands of years of, basically like a software update and there's a metaphorical now there's a metaphorical analogy there that you could look at, these religious systems, it's like software updates, because we do have a religious impulse, and that's because religious thinking is basically a human universal in a sense.
Yeah. Okay. So
I guess
my curiosity. Okay, sorry. What were you gonna say,
oh,
Caleb?
I was just gonna say, I guess what are we supposed to take from this? Like, what are we supposed to think that we're supposed to take religion, like these stories, more seriously, or like what is the message behind all of this?
Sean, do you have any insight?
I think, at least taking religious ideas a little more seriously rather than being completely 100% dismissive. I think it's probably more, I would say definitely more helpful than say not helpful, because one of the things I've noticed, and this is why I say the religious impulse is a human universal, is I've noticed the more our society has become secularized, and the scientists have made really great leaps and bounds for explaining things, but it's almost like something fills that power vacuum, because the religious impulse in us is pretty strong that something else will fill that void. And I would say political orthodoxy is one of the things that fills the power vacuum. Ideology definitely can fill the vacuum there, because people we inhabit a belief structure. We do, and it's not just about religious belief. It's basically your belief structure is predicated on what you value. What you value, it determines what your perceptions, your motivations, and your actions are going to be. This is the clinical literature and the psychological literature on that is very clear. And so you can kind of see how, like, you try to get rid of one, something else is there to take its place, especially if you're not really careful in what you're replacing it with. I think that might be the right way of thinking about
that. Okay, so
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Caleb.
Oh, and I was gonna say, I guess that's that's an interesting thing. It's like I don't know. I just don't know where, like, you could take that too far, or you could just learn life, like small life changing lessons from it. It just depends, like, what you do, as with a religion, or with lessons from a religion. I guess the reason, maybe the reason, Matt, are you bringing this up because it's almost like there's a conflict between science and religion, and there's this, I guess it can be problematic. Yeah,
is just because, like, I honestly, like, well, I'm like a hardcore science, rigorous, everything like that. Might just be me. Like, I have a tendency to not, I don't know, be the same way a lot of other people like are. Okay, my like, obviously, like, Peterson is unable to answer the question clearly, is there a God or not? Like, to me, I see that, and I think that it is really, really valuable that we are able to answer questions like that in a scientific way, like from like, I don't know. And then also like how like metaphors, like, are we supposed to take the conclusions of these metaphorical truths as metaphors as well, or what? Like, I'm confused here. Should we be following the Bible to every word, or should we be treating these conclusions also as metaphors? And then could these metaphors be fallacious? Like, I don't know, like,
Well,
I
that
guess
was sort of my point. That was sort of like what I meant when I said like, how seriously are we going to take it or whatever? And you know what I mean?
I think there's
Like,
some.
yeah.
I think there's some ideas that are very valuable that should be taken seriously. Do I think we need to have a literal interpretation? I don't think that's a good idea because, well, when someone takes a literal interpretation, then they think that they know the doctrines of whatever is in the Bible, and they know it better than everybody else because they think they have the right literal interpretation. And that's where you start to see, basically the beginnings of a religious ideologue kind of start to take ideology kind of takes hold. That ideological parasite on the religious substructure tends to take hold, and then that's where you see religious ideologues. So it's kind of like, you might not want to be doing that. Now, I would say that everybody's going to have their own different understanding of whatever's in these things. Like, Jung looked at Christianity in the Bible and looked at the stories and looked at the archetypical patterns of behavior that could be abstracted out and acted out and embodied that would work well for people, especially from a therapeutic standpoint. And I just finished a book not too long ago on the psychological issues of biblical lore of the Old Testament, where they looked at all the different stories in the Bible, but they really took more of a actual like psychological science standpoint of things, like Erickson's stages of development as it's applied to like the way they described development and growing within the Hebrew tribes of the Old Testament. We're looking at Jung's archetypical. There's some touch. They touched on man and his symbols a little bit from Jung, looking at symbolism and what symbols mean and all that in the story of Joseph, and he was a dream interpreter, and then of course psychoanalysis is where dreams is considered a normal cognitive function that's actually useful to look at, especially when it comes to therapy. And then let's see, Piaget's idea of more stages of development as it relates to morality. They looked at that within the biblical lore as well. And so there's different ways that you can look at that, and that's fine. And I think it's useful to look at all the different like ways that it's interpreted, and you can abstract out the commonalities, and you can kind of I guess make up your mind as to what you find useful and what you might decide isn't useful at all. And I think that's probably the right way of thinking about that, rather than buying into some mass interpretation that has to be true.
Yeah.
So like,
I will be right back, guys. I gotta run to the bathroom real quick. You guys keep talking. Just be right
so
back.
I'm seeing a very clear, like there can be obvious reasons for treating poems and stuff as true, or not as true, forgive me, as useful for sure. Like they can be heuristics, they can be representations of like statistical things. Like you can't ignore problems, you can't let yourself slip. Like you can think of a lot of these different things, and I do think that a lot of these things can be validated and they can be reasoned for from a perfectly secular view. And I don't know, I don't see, like, you could theoretically come up with a metaphorical, like I could probably come up with an example of a metaphorical lesson that is false, or that it is not the right thing to be followed in at that time. And like, do you agree with that? That there are some things that
I think I do agree with you on that. There are some things that, obviously would work.
My next question would be like, are we treating these things as true because they fit our reality, or is it just that or is it that we're picking and choosing what lessons are quality and which ones are less than, or that like they don't quite fit or work in all things? Like you could think of a metaphor like, oh yeah, like you should trust your elders, as like, okay, yeah, and that could be true in a lot of instances, but in a lot of other ones, dang it.
I think it really depends on the situation as to what you. I really think that what it does is it depends on the situation. As a real, I think the story, the moral that's contained within the story really depends upon the situation that it's applied. Because like you said, like always trust your elders could be true enough in a various amount of situations, but it might not be true in other situations. And this is why I advocate for maybe a more of an individualist approach.
I just caught the last end of that. Sorry. Matt, you there?
I think we lost him.
Oh,
He
shit.
might hopefully try to come back.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he's a smart kid, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really, this has been a really good conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a smart kid. I don't know. I always thought he was an intelligent kid. So.
So, what do you think?
Dude, I mean, none of my problems with anything Jordan Peterson say lie with really, telling stories or telling, metaphors or anything like that. I mean, I have no, I mean, I myself, like I use things like that all the time to explain things to people. And, I like old stories like that and stuff. You know what I mean? I think what Matt might, his dilemma with it might be the religious aspect, because I think that he has some issues, maybe with like good reason with.
Well, I mean, he mentioned that he said he's more of a objective scientist. What's scientifically true, which is from the scientific method of observation, hypothesis, experiment, outcome, and then retest, make sure that the experiment was valid.
Yeah.
And I totally and that's a very, I would say that I totally understand and agree with that approach. That's why I backed out of social psychology in undergrad. I don't know if you knew this, but I actually began my training as a social psychologist, but I wasn't exactly a fan of the out in the wild experimentation, because you can't really control for the variables very well.
Yeah, man. So I may have known that. I might not have known that. I'm not sure. But yeah, there are a lot of variables when you get into that area. Like, I don't know. There are so many variables when you start talking to individual case based things, But
and so I thought behavior would be cool, but I didn't want to be a behavior analyst, and so I was like, okay. And so that's why I kind of went more into forensic psychology with the research aspect of it, and realized that that's terminal and doesn't do anybody any good. So that's why I kind of switched it up, and now I'm going for clinical and personality psychology.
Yeah.
Because in the realm of personality psychology, it's the most empirical. It's the widely accepted empirical model of measuring personality traits. It's better, it's more valid and reliable than the Myers-Briggs type inventory, which
Yeah.
I've had some fun times in my assessment class because I kind of ragged on the Myers-Briggs pretty hard.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Myers-Briggs is
It's very popular, and it's
extremely popular, but the thing is that
it's a bastardization of Jung's psychological types, because Jung talked about the extrovert and introvert and how they were typologies for personality, and everything kind of runs in these dichotomies.
Well, I wish we could get Matt back on here, because we were talking about that the other day. We were talking about the ocean model and the big five and personality psychology or whatever. We were just sitting there bullshitting about it, and it'd be cool if to get him back on, because I'd say some of his questions are actually about those very things. Has he messaged you or anything?
He's coming back in. He's coming back in.
Geez. Okay.
He's joining.
Anyways, dude, off topic, I guess you're probably done with the semester, aren't you?
I will be after next week. I still have one more week of classes, but I've done my finals and I've written my final papers.
Yeah, that's cool. How's shit going with that?
So far, grades are good. Dealing with professors. The one professor who I can't believe she has a PhD from the way she acts, and then the other professor I really like. So,
Well, hey, never doubt anybody is a doctor, because I've met doctors who have told me about like tripping acid. you know what I mean? Like, so you can't ever doubt anybody has a fucking PhD or a doctorate.
well, when you're a professor at a university and you have a PhD, I mean, there's some decorum that I think is expected in how you teach classes. But that's just I would say that's just my preference.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just saying that we're all human, and we all have done crazy shit, stupid shit, and seriously, like it's mind-blowing, that type of, like, when you find out things like about doctors or PhDs private lives and stuff.
Yeah, I do hope
never trust anyone on Facebook who's like, oh yeah, this doctor like said the earth is flat. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Whatever. Anyways,
but Jonathan, more back to your point where you said the difference between like the metaphorical truth and the objective scientific thing. I totally understand where you're coming from.
I found my point. So if we're picking and choosing which of the metaphorical truths we're trusting, doesn't that seem to indicate that we are using, or that metaphorical truth is subject to scientific truth, or that things have to be borne out in reality in order to be trusted by in order for the metaphor to be a good metaphor? Or
I think the second part is right, that the metaphor is tried out in the real world, predicated on individual experience, and then you can decide which metaphors are good or not good depending on the situation. Because I like the way you put that about like always trusting your elders, that yes, that can be true in many situations, but it could be not true in other situations. So so I think I agree with the latter.
Okay, so I got another thing that I found, or that I wanted to ask, and that is, do you think that it is true that there is a God?
Putting Sean on the spot here. The religion thing.
I would say that I think that people have their own gods, and that means that their own ideals. That's their projected ideal. And so
Okay.
that projected ideal, that's the very best way that things could be, or the best you that you could try to be. And so when you have that, then you could think of that as God, I hope I'm not butchering this, but there's a guy that I've listened to. He's talked about God as an enforcement mechanism. So
Yeah.
and so you could think of your ideal, because I've always described, if someone, because someone's asked me about describing what I think God is, and I said, it's more like an ideal mode of being, like the most ideal mode of being that you can conceptualize and then try to embody and act out in a way that you can meet that ideal. I know it sounds funny, but
No,
it's like and this is what I told Pangburn, that it's like you could think of it as the most ideal, highest mode of being that you could aspire to, and that's the enforcement mechanism that's going to that judge. You could think of it as the enforcement mechanism that judges use, so that when you're not doing the things that you could be doing to meet that ideal mode of being. You can think of it that way.
Yeah. Hang on, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But okay, so if you have some ideal, does it really make sense what if that ideal is, well, I would say that ideal is a potential thing that could exist in the future if you follow all your goals. But like, I don't see why we would you wouldn't bow down and worship your ideal of your future self. Well, I guess you could come up with some metaphors.
A person could, and I think that's where the collective society comes into play. And this is where God, where you could think of God as the collective superego, right, of a society. It's the enforcement mechanism that guides a society's what would you say, an unconscious consensus of a way that society should act to keep the society functioning. You can think of it that way. I think this is really pushing me out past my, because I've never really thought this far about it, because I'm still looking at the individual way of thinking about this before making the jump to the collective. So thank you for getting my brain going on this.
All right.
But you could think,
no pressure.
but you could think of it that way. If you could make the argument that, say, worshiping something like that, that's where you follow through your goals. That's one way of worshiping. That's making the sacrifices, getting rid of the patterns of behavior that aren't working for you, that's keeping you from getting what you want or need, that your ideal future, your ideal self that you're working towards. You could think of it. You could think of it that way. So there's where the metaphor of sacrifice, and I think that's what you were getting. I could be wrong, but I think that's what you were getting.
How do I think about this? So it still seems like I could say, okay, there is definitely ideals that society has, and it is productive oftentimes to follow those ideals and, in a sense, attempt to, what do you call it, bow down before those ideals and try to dedicate a lot of effort to it. But there is not a physical God that actually acts in the world, and we shouldn't be sending our prayers up on balloons necessarily to communicate with this God, or to try to get it to do things for us. Like, it seems like that statement is true, right? That there is a metaphorical God, but not a real life God, right?
Yeah, I think that's the right way of thinking about that. I think the outlier behavior, because I don't know how many people act without looking at polls. I can't make any definitive statements on how many people would say send their prayers up on a balloon, but I would say maybe those are acted out ritual behaviors that are
like, people have a tendency to, I don't know, do rain dances or whatever of some form, or they'll like go and pray to, or go and they'll do things to try to get like this god to help them in some way. And it's just like, you could say, oh, this metaphorical god, even if it was, even in the context of the religion, it still isn't good to expect things from this god. You just act as you're supposed to, and yet you'll get good things from it. But all right, so I just like,
Oh,
I personally, all right, what do you have, Caleb?
oh, I was just gonna say, there's also, there's like this thin line there. It's like believing in something that's untrue, just out of the sake of tradition, or out of, fear, or something like that, or superstition. Like, if I walk around my house 5 times, it's my cat's gonna come back inside. Or if I walk around my house 5 times, it's gonna rain outside. Like, maybe my cat does come back inside, but did that have anything to do with it? Like, and what is the purpose of this ritual? And things like, you know what I'm saying?
You
Yeah,
can make you can
yeah.
make you can make arguments for the origins of certain rituals, right? I mean, our modern humans have been around for what, roughly a few thousand years, more than
Yeah.
but you,
I think
okay,
that
so
I guess that is right. Like maybe 65,000 is a general estimate, and then you could theoretically maybe more if,
you could go
say,
plus or minus. Yeah, you could
Yeah.
hypothetically plus or minus like 2 or 3,000 years.
Yeah.
So you could make the argument that perhaps somebody acted out a certain behavior and there was an outcome, totally coincidental, and they try it again and maybe another thing happens, just coincidental. And so you have this
Right.
anecdotal, A happens because we did X. So if we do X, we'll get A. But
Yeah.
sometimes A doesn't happen and you get B, which is the opposite of A, right? So you could see that as an argument for the origin of certain rituals. But there are certain rituals that have specific meaning too. Like what's a good example? So
Well,
You could use the Brett Weinstein example, that whenever the whenever the tide recedes, like it's because a god is like, I don't remember the exact example, but eventually it ended up protecting this village community from like a tsunami, and that was what the ritual actually meant, or the origins of the ritual. Like it had something to do with.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of rituals of initiation, that kind of thing, because one of the things that Jung pointed out was that because we know that personality isn't necessarily 100% fixed. You could say that you're going to probably have some personality traits that are going to be more inflexible and others probably more flexible. And of course that depends on the transition from, say, childhood to adolescence to say early adulthood and then adulthood and all of that. And so you could say that to bring from child to adolescent, that change in personality, that some cultures, they have rituals of initiation that demarcate this going from one stage of development to the next kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly, over time, I've like come to appreciate like more like cultures and like the effects it has on people, like be that with warrior rituals, training up people to be like tougher and be more ready to face the real world, as opposed, like there are various things that like I'm sure could be done better in our society in terms of rituals and like making people into like solid human beings. I've definitely come to appreciate that. But like I still like generally I would say if you believe that a superstition, like say, I don't know, Christmas. Christmas could be a good example of a tradition that is, it doesn't necessarily have that much backing behind it in terms of like its
It's
actual.
kind of fun. Kind of everybody likes Christmas, and
Yeah, you could
but
definitely like that. That would definitely, I would consider that a tradition that has a positive like thing going
mhm.
with it. But
But
my like gripe with it is just in general, like actually believing the metaphor in terms of like the superstition, like, oh yeah, you eat a certain food and you're gonna have good luck, or like you I don't know, like you could think of a tradition which is positive for people, but like I don't know, salting crops for a good harvest. Like I don't know, you could probably think of some like good tradition in regards to that that might have even been true. But the thing that I've seen is people believing that tradition as real fact, like say salting the crops, and then if they don't do it and then all the crops die, then they're like going crazy and they're mad at themselves, and they spend their whole lives tearing themselves to pieces because they didn't follow that ritual, and they end up like doing irrational things to follow superstitions, and they end up like, because they're not able to treat it as a metaphor or maybe something like that, then they end up like tearing themselves apart and like not going like, what is a good example of this,
well,
like
Matt,
spending
Matt,
thousands of dollars for on astrologers or on like psychics and stuff like that to appease this like superstition, which might even be metaphorically true,
Yeah.
but they just end up like getting, if they don't understand that it's a metaphor, then it does generally
well,
cause more harm than good in my estimation. Like,
that I agree with you there, but see, now I didn't think that was a thing that was in question. I assume that like yeah, telling stories about whatever the fuck, the old man and the wicked witch of the west with the whatever, like telling a story to relate to real life is different than believing in a god that's going to like save you or you know somehow alter your life. So I just kind of like, for the purposes of what we're talking about, divided those two things. Like like it's, if you want to talk about like believing in the superstition versus using the stories of the superstition to explain things in life, I think those are two completely different things. Now, is your issue when people get those things mixed up, or
it's just like fundamentally, it seems like Peterson values the metaphor almost. Like I can't tell if Peterson is actually religious or not, or maybe he's just playing to a religious audience. But like I don't see these metaphors as being true. Like I don't see is there a God or not as really that hard of a question when speaking of the physical like reality. Like,
I think he values the religion highly.
well,
yeah,
I don't think he's religious in the sense of like someone that goes to church and believes in a supernatural entity that created everything. But I
yeah,
think that because if you look at, so from what I understand, Peterson, when he defines belief, is I act as if God exists. So that definition comes from two
okay,
different sources.
so
One being Emil Durkheim, who looked at religious as a social activity. Religious wasn't necessarily a divine intervention. This is where the idea of the religious impulse being a human universal is that religion is an activity that humans act out. So
Yeah.
and then Willem Friedhoff was a person who looked at belief, and he because Willem Friedhoff was interested in exploring morality, because most people who are religious, meaning that they believe in a supernatural entity, for them morality is a top-down process. But what Friedhoff thought of was of morality from a bottom-up process, and so that beliefs are typically acted out, so they're related to actions. And I think that's where Peterson gets the definition of belief as in what you act out, and it comes from both Durkheim and Friedhoff.
Now,
Okay, so
I have a
my
different take on it. I think he is religious because what made me think he was religious is when he talked about the spiritual experiences of taking mushrooms, being able to just completely quit smoking or whatever. What he was debating Dillahunty or whatever,
yeah,
Matt
Matt
Dillahunty.
Dillahunty.
I started to realize that I think that he believes in a higher power, which, dude, that's fine. I mean, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that or anything. It's just, I think that there's a little bit of a almost a Bob Dylan-esque thing going on there, where he doesn't want to show his cards. He doesn't want to tell people what he actually believes. You know what I mean? That's my personal opinion, though. Like I think that he wants to remain kind of secretive about,
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
true beliefs.
I agree with that as well. Like, as insulting as it is, I kind of feel like there's a little bit of, well, like I feel like in debating leftists and trying to own the left, he sort of backed himself into a corner. And then he also has a large portion of his audience which is Christian, and he sort of doesn't want to drive them away. Like honestly, Jordan Peterson played a fairly big role in my turning secular, because he was able to bridge the gap between Christianity and evolution, and then I was able to bridge the gap between Christian atheism and pure atheism. And so, like, I would definitely say that he's productive for the secular world. Like, I can't exactly calculate it, but I feel like he might even be, well, I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say that he is a positive influence on the world. I don't think that has the best models of things, and sometimes he leads people in, and like, he's not perfect, of course, but I just feel like, I don't know,
Well,
that
I
he might
think
be.
a lot of people that get introduced to Jordan Peterson, they read his books. I don't know if they read the scientific papers that he's written. But one of the things that I have done is I've gone back, because all the books that he recommends, I've got the list. I've bought most of them. I've read a few of them, but I've also deviated from that.
Yeah, for sure. You seem fairly well written, or well read, and very diversified, as I like, from the original. You're not just like swallowing Peterson and like, this is my viewpoint. So you've obviously come to a lot of conclusions on your own as well.
Well, I mean, I've read everything I can get my hands on that's gone from personality. Like, I think Peterson's only recommended 3 or 4 of Jung's books, and I've read like 6 or 7 of them. I'm currently reading his development of personality and papers on child psychology right now, the development of personality from his collected works. I didn't stop at the interpretation of dreams from Freud. I read Freud's lectures on psychoanalysis and his little small treatise on dream psychology.
Yeah.
So, and of course, I sit here and I try to wrestle and grapple with some of these questions, like what does belief mean? It's like, well, and so what I did, so one of the things I've done to try to help, not just help me, but also help other people is that, where I work, I did a group based on maps of meaning, where I've went through the book, I've gone through the lectures, I've gone through the background literature for the book maps of meaning, and try to say, okay, well, I only get like maybe 3 or 4 out of the whole world, because we were doing groups on the wards because of the whole COVID thing. So I only had like 3 people out of a ward of like 12. It's like, well, you guys, you may not be able to say that you believe that this is useful, but this is what you're acting out because you're sitting here, you're not shuffling your feet, you're not having small conversations amongst yourselves, you're not nodding off sleeping, you're looking at me, you're nodding along, you're asking questions, so you're acting as if you believe this is valuable, kind of thing. And so they'll sit there and they thought about that for a second. It's like, so you could think about, what is it you value? Well, obviously you value this, because otherwise you wouldn't be up here, you wouldn't be listening to this, you wouldn't be asking me questions about this. You wouldn't be answering questions if I say, okay, well, what is it that you value out of your time here? Because when you're in maximum security, you're not there on your own, of your own choice.
Yeah.
And so getting them to explore what it is they value and what it is they hope to accomplish, so that they can eventually be discharged back out into the community once they go through the gradual release process. That's, so I would say that's one way that you could look at belief, is it's like, okay, well, what is it that you actually believe about certain things? It doesn't necessarily have to be about God, but just about ways of living. Is, I would, and it wasn't, I did. So when I took the theories class for this counseling master's that I'm in, that's when I learned that I was leaning more towards like a mix of existentialism and psychoanalytic theory, as far as like theories when it comes to counseling and therapy. And people are born into the situations that they're born into. Rollo May wrote this really, he was an existential psychologist, but he wrote this thing about, it's really interesting to think about that you were born here and now, when you could have been born then, meaning years ago, or you could have been born more into, sometime into the future, but you're born into the circumstances that you're born in, so you have to kind of deal with that. And so what do you do about that? Because when you really think about, well, you could have been born 30 years ago or 20 years from now, but you're born here into this circumstances with this family, with all of these problems. It's like, this is part of existence. And so you kind of have to find a way to deal with that in a way that works, that's meaningful and worthwhile, because otherwise, anxiety, depression, that just kind of come with life. You could say it's the price you pay for existence. And so you kind of have to believe that certain things that you act out are going to work for you, so that way you don't fall into what Kierkegaard called it angst, which is like existential anxiety or dread, or existential depression, because people get cut off at the knees all the time and just terrible things happen. And so so you kind of have to have a value and a belief system that you believe that if you act out a certain way, that your life is going to be less terrible for you than what it could be. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I've had two like really, I would say, insights into how this discussion goes. So first of all, does anyone remember what the name for the bad Santa is? It's like Peter or something, like Black Peter, maybe.
You talking about Krampus?
Yeah, I guess Krampus sounds about right. Yeah. So imagine that there's a metaphor. Well, people have a tendency, especially kids, especially the majority of people humans in general have a tendency to see cycles going and figure, I can always cut it off at a later date. This will never happen to me. You know, like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna go out in public, but I won't spread coronavirus. I won't catch coronavirus. These are like the mental shortcuts. Like people have a tendency to make decisions which are not rational because they assume that they won't fall prey to the same things. And you can think of probably metaphors to, okay, how do I explain this?
It's never gonna happen to me.
Yeah, it's never going to happen to me. Like, and then you might go out into public 100 times without a mask, and yet you,
Be
like,
fine.
every time, well, you might go out into public 100 times without a mask because every single time you're thinking there's a really low likelihood that it's going to happen to me, and then like naturally one of those 100 times you are much, if you do one thing 100 times, you're quite likely to get it. But people have a
Right.
tendency to think, oh, it's really unlikely, oh, it's really unlikely, and they continue down these paths and they do the same thing over and over again, sort of betting on their luck. And you can think of that, like that's really is the proportion, is the thing that, well, it's one of the biggest moral problems in general, is people, what do you call it, trying their luck and basically like going at it. Say like I feel sick today, like I might have COVID, but I don't know, it's unlikely. And then I go out in public and then I do that again, and I do that again. And we make this shortcut and I do this thing which is might not cause any harm, but it's still morally bad because of the likelihood of it causing harm. And naturally, if you have everyone not taking the personal responsibility and not cutting off that shortcut and not being safe from a statistical standpoint, I don't know if you guys are understanding what I'm saying. Like,
I think I get what you're
I
saying. Is it's basically like people typically tend to fall into habits, and anything that runs contrary to that, they're less likely to do. For even though the inconvenience would be better for all, but it's still an inconvenience that nobody wants to engage.
so like actually what I mean is, like, say you're doing a job and your boss does something bad, and you're like, well, if I say anything about it, I could get fired. And so you think, well, it's really bad, but if I don't say anything, I probably will be okay. Everyone else will probably be okay. But the thing is, if you have everyone in the system doing that, you essentially get Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is a bunch of people shucking off the individual responsibility and thinking, oh, it's never going to happen to me. It's
Yeah,
unlikely. And everyone else is doing it. And so what you can think of is that culture has invented these methods like Krampus, like
enforcement
to
mechanism.
basically scare people into doing the right thing, even when it's unlikely that it's actually going to make like a negative or positive difference. They're really just trying to force everyone into following these habits so that you don't have the whole society like breaking the law, because if the whole society breaks the law, everything falls apart. And so you have basically, you tell kids, you better do the right thing or else Krampus is going to come and kick your ass or whatever, like
Yeah,
dump coal
yeah.
in your
Yeah,
stockings. And so you basically,
it's a
like,
social
invent these
enforcement
mechanisms.
mechanism to get people to work toward a common good. You could think of that way.
Yeah. So the other example of this is like karma. And you basically have this idea that if you do good things, then good things will happen to you. If you do bad things, then bad things will happen to you. And I think that it's metaphorically true. It's 100% the case that if you do, if you do good things, then eventually good things will happen to you. And that's true. But it's sometimes, in some cases, it's false. Like sometimes you're just going to get hit in the knees. Sometimes you're going to end up with some unalterable disease, and you're going to end up dying, or you're going to end up with a miserable life. And these things, like, it's valuable to have an idea like karma.
Yeah, and so
but then you have people who believe in karma, and they believe in it so much that if they do something bad, that they go on their whole life worried that they're gonna get hit by a car, like that, or if they do good things, that if they do good things, then good things are necessarily going to happen to them. And if that doesn't happen, then they end up really upset. And so I don't know. It's like the social enforcement mechanism is true, but it's also can be toxic when it can be toxic in certain circumstances.
It depends, and I would say that that's where you have to wonder if there's an ideological parasite in the substructure of the idea. You know, it is true that typically when you do good things for people, you do get rewarded for that. But it's also true that there's a random element to life, and people who are highly agreeable and altruistic, they do typically run the risk of being exploited by somebody who's less agreeable and more antisocial.
Yeah.
That's typically true as well. But you know, the social enforcement mechanism is supposed to be put into place so that societies typically will, or individuals within a society will work for a common goal. So this is one of the things with like Travis Pangburn, where we had a disagreement on the idea of what an objective morality is the term objective, meaning that there's an objective that the society is working toward. Like you mentioned the COVID example, that the idea is the objective is that we minimize the risk of a major community spread of a deadly disease. And you know, and there are people that obviously didn't take it seriously. But I think I still think that, you know, at the individual level, people typically are more agreeable without, say, insistence by force on certain things. And me and Caleb have gone back and forth on this whole thing. It's like, Caleb, I think if I remember correctly, you were more pro-mask than I was when it came to that. And I think it's because we both live in pretty rural areas. I think, Jonathan, you'll understand this argument here, because Nevada is pretty damn rural where you're at.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I thought before the vaccine was available that you should wear a mask.
I think it depends on the situation, and I've always said that it should be up to individual discretion. For me, I was taking airborne, elderberry, vitamin D, vitamin C, vitamin B12, orange juice every morning. I haven't changed my routine since. I still take a men's one a day, but it has like magnesium and zinc in it. So that's like 7 different supplements to boost my immunity. Now, in a major crowded building, yes, I think a mask is not an unreasonable request to, would you say, an unreasonable request to just comply along with. However, there are certain situations where I think it got taken to the extreme. I would see people hiking, biking, and running on trails outside in the woods with like a mask or 2 masks on.
Well, I mean, but
and I thought,
keep in mind that I never wore a mask outside of my entire life.
I'm not accusing you of such. I'm just saying that these are things that I've observed, and I'm sure that you probably observed the same behaviors.
Not here in Greenbrier County, but that's just, you know, because it's not a populated area. Maybe that, I'm sure that might have happened in cities and stuff.
But we do know people that have said that the mask mandates weren't strict enough.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
So, you know, I think it would have been better left to, say, the locality to decide what was appropriate for itself rather than a whole state, because I don't think that it's necessarily correct for, like, say, Elko and Elbers, Wells, Eureka and Ely to have to follow the same mandates for some place like Las Vegas, Carson City, or Reno.
Now, while annoying, do you really think that's authoritarian? I mean,
I
yeah, kind of annoying, but there is a pandemic. I mean, like, yeah, it kind of got on my nerves the last time I had to go. I went into a store that was still enforcing the mask mandate, and yeah, it was like a little bit like, dude, this shit's over with, but I still put on the mask. You know what I mean? Like,
I know what you mean.
A little bit irritating.
I would say that if you had
But-
competent leaders at the state level, the localities should have been able to handle their own mandates.
But
Because they know that
Like,
they know their population
I
better
would
than the
disagree.
state does.
Well, okay. There's been this. Sorry, can you guys hear me all right?
yeah,
Okay. Well, there's this
I can't
podcast that
see you.
I would really recommend. Yeah, I know. It's dark out right now and I'm out where there's but anyways, there's this podcast which is really, really good. And literally throughout the whole pandemic, they predicted everything right. So back in the beginning,
It's a
when they were
Sean
talking
Sullivan
about
podcast.
yeah, no
No,
disrespect. Back in the beginning of the pandemic, when Fauci was saying we should not be wearing masks, masks are not effective. They predicted that masks, or they said that masks are a good thing and that they should be followed. Then once they started getting into other things, they're talking. Okay, anyways, I'll just say it out loud. Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying did a really good podcast following this whole pandemic.
Yeah.
Both it being from the lab leak hypothesis, which is nowadays becoming more and more confirmed by the scientific research. They have been on that from the beginning, and not just from like a conspiracy theory, like, oh, it's a bioweapon, oh, it's the government like trying to shut everything down, and this is all some conspiracy. They were actually coming at it from like a biological perspective and predicting all sorts of things about like, and they really they stayed ahead on the research. I would very strongly recommend that podcast. Also very good at like teaching like how to think scientifically and like criticisms of research. I found it really interesting.
Yeah, Brett Weinstein's podcast is really, really good. I agree with you. And he was, even in the beginning of the pandemic, when he went on Joe Rogan's podcast, after he said, it's very likely that this thing is not a natural virus. My hypothesis was that it was engineered, but it was maybe not for. I think the hypothesis is just that they were doing, functional research.
Yeah.
My hypothesis was that because China is known for human rights violations like no other. We do know that they had a one-child policy there for a long time. We do know that they've now instituted a two-child policy. I think that's been in the last 5-6 years. I think I'm not exactly 100% sure. And that was because they didn't have enough young people to take care of all the elderly people. And my thinking was, if you're a totalitarian state, you have an elderly problem, as they would say. What do you do about that if you're a totalitarian state? Well, you find a way to get rid of all the old people. How do you do that without just marching them out into the streets and executing them, which I'm sure they would probably have no problem doing anyway? Oh, you have this viral lab that you're dealing with these really nasty viruses. What if we just oopsie out into the public and then problem takes care of itself, kind of thing? Only problem is it didn't stay restricted to China. It went all over the place.
Now, see, okay, so that's half, dude, that is half conspiracy, half possible.
I'm just saying that was my hypothesis from the beginning.
All right. Well, I'm just saying that half of that what you said is possible. Like, dude,
It's just not
they
validated by the evidence.
Yeah, it's
They-
not validated by the evidence, and
Well,
the evidence
so,
is
like-
obviously not suggesting that.
well, wait,
Okay.
no, I'm saying that like there is a possibility that it leaked from a lab.
Yeah,
Now intent.
that
is
was
part-
what that was my hypothesis, was the intent behind the virus getting out.
Now,
So you guys want to hear, like, I followed the science on this. Like, I've always been like a really hard science person,
Sure.
but like, what my understanding of it is, and there were people from the beginning that were saying, oh yeah, there's no chance at all that this leaked from a lab, which is naturally, or this is naturally a very bad hypothesis. But they did have some evidence, and that was that the protein, or there's certain things, there's certain viruses, and they're really matched up really well to these certain keys almost. It's like a receptor.
Mhm.
And the way these viruses work is they find these certain ways to latch on to certain cells. And what they found is that the virus actually doesn't attach to a human cell nearly as good as it would if it was a bioweapon. Now that was used as somehow proof that there's no possible way that it leaked from a lab, which is not logical at all.
Yeah, it's bollocks.
And would indicate some what do you call it, dishonesty on the part of them. Now, it also, like, it's a really good indicator of how dishonest, like, the majority of our systems are, and how there was all this what do you call it, cloak and dagger, okay, not cloak and dagger,
Smoke and
game
mirrors
theoretic,
kind of
like,
thing.
right, yeah, smoke and mirrors, that's a right thing, of ways of dealing with it, like trying to fool the public into operating. Now, this is not to say that I don't think it was a bioweapon. I think that if it was a bioweapon, it would probably match up better to humans. Now you could say, oh yeah, that there was, again, like, that it was engineered so it looked like it was naturally or origin, and like that's 100% possible. But at the same time, there's no like real evidence to support that.
I would say there's medical literature
not-
that points to this thing not being 100% a natural occurring virus, and that's
Yeah, I do think that there is evidence that the mechanisms that COVID had to transfer to humans, there was not enough, that that would have been a leap, which was not, like, I believe some evolutionary biologists looked into it, and they found that, oh yeah, that this is extremely rare, and it actually costs a virus in an evolutionary lens to make this jump, or to get this mutation, and therefore it wouldn't happen naturally. And so that was evidence that it was a lab leak. Another piece of evidence was that, oh yeah, it is definitely, I believe it has been proven that it is in some way a bat virus. I believe that is the case. Now, the real question is, why did it originate in Wuhan? Whereas I don't think that that Wuhan has a very big bat population, whereas it does have a lab, which is very rare, and the possibilities of those two things happening, plus the gain of function research, plus the
okay. See,
stuff like
that's
that,
where
I
we're
do
getting.
think it generally supports
That's
the
where we're
hypothesis.
getting. That's where we're getting a conspiracy. Like, okay, seriously, hear me out on this. They in Wuhan, there are labs there that specifically study things like bats, because they're studying things for agriculture, like because in like cows and shit like that, COVID has been a thing forever, right?
Yeah.
And over there, like they've studied those viruses, and it like the idea that, and this is they've done it for decades, like they've done it for years and years, like what happened if it leaked from the lab? I highly doubt it was intentional or whatever.
Yeah, I would agree
Um,
with that.
Now, let's say there was some mad scientist who leaked it. Like, what does that fucking do?
Well,
Like, I
yeah,
mean,
again,
like,
like I said, the fact that was so, what would you say? I think this is where I got the idea that it was engineered, was when we know people that have either come into contact with people that have had it or have had it, and it's attacked several different systems several different ways. There's no there it's not 100% the same for every person. There are some symptoms that are the same. It's like the loss of taste and smell and
that's the big one.
the fever and all that, but the pericarditis, that was an extremely rare condition that's now more common. We know Mr. Alder's got that heart arrhythmia now where his heart
It's terrible, man.
cannot stay regulated, and he had COVID.
It's so terrible.
There's some people that were asymptomatic that developed a pericarditis, which is I think it's a more severe form of pericarditis. I might be wrong about that. I'm not a medical doctor. I've just looked into the medical literature once we started seeing these different effects after someone's had COVID, the way that the heart has and other systems have been attacked by the virus after that. So that's what pointed me to this whole thing. It's not just a natural virus. There's got to be something that was added to it.
Well,
I would say that.
Wait, guys, hold on. I gotta say this again. COVID-19 has been a thing in farm animals for decades. So it's always been out there. It's not like nobody could have added something to it. I'm positive of that.
What do you mean nobody could have added something to it?
Well, he was saying, I think, Sean, were you saying that somebody could have like altered the virus in some way?
The virus that leaked from the lab, either by accident or what have you, that we've been dealing with for well over a year now.
Yeah.
There's other coronaviruses that have occurred in nature. I think the common cold is considered a coronavirus. Okay.
Yeah.
This thing,
COVID-19 has been
COVID-19, as far as this pandemic goes, it does not act like any of the other respiratory viruses that we have dealt with, whether it be the common cold, whether it be influenza, SARS, MERS, and all of that.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to this is extremely, like, any field for the most part has a huge amount of depth to it. Now, I would say that virology, this is really quite true. You're dealing with probably 6 months studying genetics, 6 months studying chemistry, 6 months studying cell system, 6 months studying a ton of different things. Like, it's extremely complicated dealing with these things, and I'm skeptical about the use in us. I don't know what I'm doing. I really don't know very much about virology, and I don't know. I'm skeptical about how on point any of us are going to be, or how rational of a conversation we can have about this, considering that I don't know. I wouldn't say that any of us, I might be wrong, but I don't think any of us here have extensive virology understanding. Am I right?
I have a basic understanding of molecular biology because my associates was in biology, but so it's very, very basic, fundamental. I'm just based on the clinical medical literature from the Journal of the American Medical Association that I kept up with on this is where I've based my opinions on the data there, and looking at the symptoms and everything else. And this hasn't acted like other viruses that have been there in the past.
Yeah,
And-
yeah, I
and-
could agree
and-
with that.
and
for sure.
so and
I don't think that's controversial, actually. So
yeah, and I before there was any data, it was like, what made me think about how do you deal with your elderly population that you don't have enough people to take care of? And like I said, China's been known to murder lots of people for any different arbitrary reason. There's a documentary that's on Amazon I highly recommend. It talks about China's one-child policy, and some of the things that they did is absolutely appalling. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility that the Chinese Communist Party wouldn't just use, what would you say? It's not unreasonable to hypothesize that the Chinese Communist Party wouldn't have a hand in some way getting rid of their elderly population in means that would be easy to cover up.
yeah, I would argue that you could come up with uh a lot of different hypotheses, but like the
Yeah.
biggest thing, the thing that's going to matter is what you have evidence for. And,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. And we can make hypotheses predicated on observations and previous knowledge, but where the data goes is where the data goes. And I never once
Yeah.
even said that I was right, or that I was even in the right, what would you say, right in the right ballpark.
Yeah. Yeah, like we can obviously like normal, well, it's certainly within our grasp to make very simple logical arguments, like to say that, oh yeah, it's not exactly a bioengineering, or it's not a bioweapon. You can't extend that to, oh yeah, it's totally impossible that it was a lab leak. That's not, like, we can see that, and we can tell that it is illogical to
Yeah.
say that, or that the conclusion is not justified by the premises, so to speak. And like that's 100% in our grasp, but like for the most part, I don't know. I don't feel like making, like, questioning. I don't know how productive this discussion would be. I don't know, like that.
No, I think it's just good to kind of explore these ideas. I don't know if
Yeah,
this is
for
going to
sure.
give me any strikes on my YouTube channel, because apparently this is one of those.
For sure. Like the YouTube treatment of these hypotheses is definitely an indicator of, well, I don't know. Like there have been some.
It's a problem, especially when it comes to free speech and the ability to challenge ideas, or to have ideas, or to share ideas.
Yeah, I certainly don't like it. Have you followed any of Brett Weinstein and Heather Hines like videos on this? Because they have been like,
I've seen a few videos. Nothing recently in the last month, but I'd say it was 4 or 5 months ago. I was watching a couple of them. I know there was a thing that he did on Twitter a couple of days ago where he was talking about he had 2 strikes on his channel, and it's now with the hashtag follow the silence, because YouTube is silencing him talking about this.
yeah,
And
it's so much smoke and mirrors involved, and like everyone trying to like follow the narrative and like shut down these different views which oppose them, and then like even though they don't have the evidence, and then once they do have the evidence, and oh, it was mainstream all along, and what are you talking about? And just like so much deception, and like trying to play with people's opinions, and try while also trying to keep the faith in them, so to speak. Like, I don't know, it's been so much of that, but
yeah, it's been very, very weird.
Yeah.
Changing topics, I guess. Me and Kale were kind of talking back and forth while we were waiting for you to reconnect, but he was mentioning that you were talking to him about the difference between like the big 5 personality model and say the Myers-Briggs, because I actually made some friends in my assessments class, because I rip on the Myers-Briggs pretty hardcore.
Yeah. Okay, this is slightly tangential, but it seems like sometimes psychology, like, people can be really like confused about even basic things. I'm
Mhm.
curious, like, how many of your psychology friends like people in college for psychology actually like believe in Myers-Briggs, because it seems like you can still be rather educated but still believe in such silly ideas, in my opinion.
Okay,
Like
so the people that are in my assessments class these are people that are coming in with a bachelor's in psychology or social work, and they're taking this just to be a psychotherapist, a mental health counselor. So for them, the Myers-Briggs, due to its popularity, it's rather easy to interpret for a client. That's why they tend to like it. But what they don't like is someone like me who comes in from a science background saying, you know, we can say with relative certainty that yes, you can reliably predict the introversion extroversion dichotomy in the Myers-Briggs, and you can do that with traits extroversion and neuroticism from a Big Five perspective. In fact, the topology for extrovert versus introvert load heavily on those two traits, and so there's no question in the validity of that. It's the problem I have is that a person can score pretty predictably.
mediocre.
Well, they can score
bad.
pretty. They can make roughly the same, have roughly the same scores amongst two or three of the topologies versus all four. One's always going to change depending on what a person feels, because it is a subjective self-report. My problem with the Myers-Briggs is because the two ladies that designed the damn thing, they bastardized Jung's ideas of the psychological types from his book, on psychological types, from his collected works. It was fine as an assessment back in the 1940s because, you know, anytime that you're coming up with an assessment, obviously there's going to be some bugs that need to be fixed. But
Yeah.
once McCrae and Costa did the work back in the 1980s and 90s and really solidified the Big Five into, you know, what is the most widely accepted empirical model, the Myers-Briggs should have been relegated to the dustbin of history. Yeah, it's a great historical marker for personality psychology as a scientific enterprise. I can understand its utility in psychotherapy, but as a scientific model, not so much.
Yeah.
And so I use the term friends very sarcastically, because they're not fans of mine, because I shut it down.
Yeah, that is I'm blown away that, like, I'm sure you can make criticisms of the Big Five model, but any criticism that you make of the Big Five model applies 1,000-fold to the Myers-Briggs.
Mm-hmm.
And like you can't, I don't know, it's so crazy. Like, I'm sure the Myers-Briggs like might even cover, like, I don't know, half of personality, like something like that. But it's just that the binary thing is the biggest thing.
It's the dichotomy that's a problem.
How it's like you can be somewhere in the middle, which is generally most people in the middle are very similar. But if you are feeling bad one day or good another day, you're in completely different worlds. Like, one time you're this incredible extrovert, and the other time you're this shy introvert.
The item validity is shit as far as I'm concerned, because what it does is it asks you to pick between two different things, and sometimes it's like apples and oranges, so it's not even within the same realm.
Yeah, you're dealing with sorry, go ahead.
No, because it'll be like, well, do you like this or do you like that? And whereas any sort of Big Five inventory,
like, to some extent, like, it's not necessarily,
whereas with any 5-factor inventory, it's usually on a Likert scale between 1 and 5. What's most like you or what's least like you, and it's a single question, and you're doing it on a Likert scale. And you're correct that there are some valid criticisms of the Big Five. One of my criticisms of the Neo Pi 3 by McCrae and Costa is it breaks. There's like 6 facets per trait of the Big Five. And that's why I like de Jong's Big Five aspect scale, because there's 2 facets. And I think that actually rounds it out much better in a way that's conceptualized, much cleaner than, say, McCrae and Costa's. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is that there's a 6-factor model called the Hexaco, which they look at
Let's see if I remember.
Honesty
Yeah,
and humility has
honesty,
been
sorry.
added. Honesty and humility is kind of taken into that.
Yeah. Has that been validated mathematically? The existence of an honesty dimension?
I think they're still working on that, because I think there's some construct validity issues with the instruments that they're looking to try to implement with the hexagon. Theoretically, it's sound, but I think honesty and humility loads more into agreeableness than it being its own trait or its own like thing separate from that. But that's just my
Yeah.
opinion.
What I'm really interested in is potentially like using AI to improve question selection. Like that would be really interesting to me, is try to figure out like the best ways to ask questions so that you're not dealing with like people comparing themselves to other people in like a subjective way, because like, I don't know, you could theoretically, let's see if I can think of an example. Like instead of asking like how clean is your room, maybe asking like how many things are out on your desk right now. Like that might be a more accurate idea. Like, and then you can incorporate that into you can make things less subjective in that way. I don't know. So should we explain to the listeners how the Big Five model comes about? Like, you
Well, I
want to do
mean,
that?
the Big Five was basically done through a factorial analysis, looking at the ways that you could describe yourself, that a person could be described. And so words like sociable and social and happy, they load onto extroversion, because extroversion is your assertiveness and enthusiasm domains of that trait. Sad or anxious load onto neuroticism.
So what do you mean by load on exactly? Like,
So those terms factor together, because that's what what they did is it's a statistical model based on adjectives and how similar adjectives are to one another, and so that it's like compassionate, polite, altruistic, honest, all of that kind of loads into trait agreeableness. Agreeable people are honest, altruistic, compassionate, polite. Neurotic people typically are emotionally dysregulated, easily irritated, sad, have a proclivity towards sadness, depression, and anxiety. Open people are more interested in ideas, or they're creative, or they're into abstract thinking, or they appreciate nature, or they're into philosophy, or they like things rather than, say, people. Conscientious people are dutiful, they're orderly, they're industrious, they work hard, they like procedure, they're tidy, they're neat. They're neat, and then extroverted people are outgoing, they're assertive, and not so much that they like conflict, but they can assert their being in the world. They can be in the world and not have a problem with it. They're, more likely to feel more positive emotion. They're more enthusiastic and more outgoing and friendly.
okay. So Caleb, do you have anything to add? On
Nothing to.
any criticisms, any thoughts, questions?
No, not really. No, not that I can think of.
So like, I don't know. So my explanation of personality, I think I've gotten decent at explaining it, because I've like tried to explain it like 40 different times to people, and like theoretically, I think I've gotten decent at it. So anyways, the idea is you generate this list of questions, which are basically 1,000 different things that might describe people, and then you ask that to 1,000 different people and get all their different measures on it. And what you find is, if you get certain questions have a tendency to relate in their occurrence of the same person asking or answering the same question in the same way. So you're going to have like the occurrences of people answering, "Are you happy?" and "Are you sociable?" Well, I guess sociable. Yeah. Are you happy and are you sociable? Those two things, like they have a tendency, the same person has a tendency to answer those two questions with a similar scoring. And so over So if you have somebody answer a bunch of those different questions, you're going to get a bunch of those different similar scorings. And so what you find is these things have a tendency to group into these rough like trait things, and they're like they could probably break down into 10, they could break down into 100, they could break down into a bunch of these little traits, but for the most part, like you can get a rough estimate on an estimate of those 5 different traits, like extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, uh, conscientiousness, and openness. That's what it is. And it's really strange because I think these things have been proven to be hereditary. Like, what do you know, Sean? Like,
Well,
I'm thinking it's around like
temper
0.3
temper
to
there
0.5.
is a biological component to temperament, and temperament is related to agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion. So you could think of it like what they call with children, like either they're reactive or they're non-reactive. A reactive child is going to typically be more neurotic, and it's because we know that like anxiety disorders, depressive disorders tend to also, like if you have a first degree relative that has a disorder like that, then the risk is increased for you if you have a relative, a first degree relative with those disorders, and that's predicated on your temperament. And so like little Timmy goes to the playground. If little Timmy goes to the playground and he wants to stay close to mom and he won't go out and he won't go explore the playground and won't go play with the other kids because that's considered a reactive child. Well, that's anxiety and withdrawal from stimulus, and that's kind of part of neuroticism. Whereas a non-reactive child, so Jimmy, for example, you take Jimmy to the playground and Jimmy's like going and playing in the sandbox and running to the swings and going to the slide, and he's hanging out with all the other kids, and he's not necessarily afraid and clinging to mom, but he's non-reactive, and that's going to be a good predictor for extroversion, let's say. And also like your temperament and like how you deal with other people, it can be with agreeableness. You're either going to be extremely polite and compassionate, genuinely want to help and be around other people, or you could be very disagreeable in your temperament. That's where you start to see more callousness and exploitativeness at the pathological end. But you could say that a person might be more likely to be less polite and kind of just tell people to F off and everything like that. Of course, they're going to be higher in neuroticism as well, because that's the social withdrawal aspect of that too. You could think of that as, what would you say? At the extreme ends of that, you could almost see that as the archetypal hermit. Has no interest in social relationships. Intimate relationships feels better if they're left to their own devices. Think of it that way. That's actually a marker for possibility of a development of schizoid personality disorder.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part. What's a predictor of schizophrenic?
Schizoid personality disorder, or people who have no interest in intimate relationships. They have no interest in social relationships. They're loners. They don't like working with other people. They don't like being around other people. They're very they're like the archetypal hermit. In fact, I could look up the diagnostic criteria for you just to kind of
So what's really like interesting about that is, I don't know, I'm really curious. Like, I've heard that autism and schizoid personality disorder are generally like polar, like they're two different. Am I wrong in this? Have you heard this before, or do you know anything about this?
So there is a difference with autism spectrum disorder, depending on where you're at, where a person would be at on the spectrum, whether they're high or low functioning, it does impair socialization and the ability to socialize properly. Because people with autism spectrum disorder, there's problems with development in the amygdala. That's a biological problem where they can't look somebody in the eyes, they can't really empathize with them. So low empathy tends to be a pattern of that. They don't read social cues very well, and so they might take people more literally, and they don't understand sarcasm, or they don't understand jokes. They might take jokes more literally, that kind of thing. And so that impairs the socialization from autism. Whereas with schizoid personality disorder, their personality, it's their mode of being. It's not so much problems with development of the brain. It's just that they have a preference for being alone and choosing to do activities alone. They don't want or enjoy any close relationships. They have very little, if any, desire for sexual relationships. They feel like they can't experience pleasure. That's anhedonia. That's one of the things you find that happens in schizophrenia. That's why it's called like on this psychotic disorder spectrum or the schizophrenic spectrum.
Is that the thing that I saw? Okay, so first of all, from what I understand about schizophrenia, and that's a very, very little bit, with schizophrenia, you're dealing with people not being able to tell the difference between reality and, say,
Depending on the
like,
severity of
no,
their
it's a, sorry. Okay, so from what I know, you can have somebody, okay, gosh, I'm so bad. You'll have somebody relate random things like, I'm going out, gosh, I can't think of the exact example, but they'll relate unrelated things. And like, if you okay, let me think about that for a second. You can go ahead and say what you're going to say about schizoid.
So the difference between schizophrenia and people with schizoid personality disorder is that people with schizoid personality disorder are in touch with reality. So they don't experience any hallucinations, paranoia, or delusions. They actually make sense when they speak, although the tone may not be very lively. So they might be very monotone. They don't really, so they don't have any strange, hard to follow conversational patterns. Whereas people with schizophrenia, particularly disorganized type, you're going to see word salad, things that don't make a lot of sense, or there's going to be tangential, there's going to be delusions and hallucinations.
Yeah, tangent, that's what I was trying to think, is that like they'll talk about various different things, and then like this, like they'll relate unrelated things, and if they're talking about like a metaphor, they will be unable to, the metaphor will be like a truth, like they won't be able to understand metaphors. They'll think that they'll mistake the metaphor for being like reality and stuff like that. Am I wrong in that?
To a degree, because people with schizophrenia, okay. So are you familiar with the concept of the positive and the negative symptoms that are associated with schizophrenia?
No, not really. Like,
Okay,
maybe
okay.
if you refresh my memory.
Okay,
like, I've heard
so
one lecture on schizophrenia, and that's it. And that's
okay, so
but
schizophrenia, you have to have positive and negative symptoms that are associated with it. Positive means that you're adding something to a person, and negative symptoms you're taking away from a person. So the positive symptoms of schizophrenia is, of course, delusions and either audio, visual, tactile, olfactory, hallucinations. So they'll either feel things on them that aren't there, they'll see things that aren't there, they'll hear voices. That's the most common hallucinations, or they'll have these delusions. They'll believe these things that just aren't true. They're beliefs that are not predicated in reality whatsoever. You can't implant a delusional thought into somebody unless they're like a paranoid schizophrenia. But the tangential word salad and things that don't make sense, that you typically see that in schizophrenia of a disorganized type. Also associated with disorganized type is
so what would be an organized type schizophrenia like?
So I don't know if you've ever seen like a person in the middle of so disorganized type, they typically will repeat certain phrases. They'll have words.
That would be more like like some sort of like crazy religious leader, right? Like somebody who
you do see some religiosity with schizophrenia. That's absolutely true. What
I don't know.
Let me see if I can try to. Let me go here to the symptoms of schizophrenia. Perhaps this will help out.
So anyways,
delusions are so the common delusions are like people believe they have superpowers, or they'll think that people are out to get them. Typically, it'll either be paranoid persecutory delusions. There's religiosity or religious delusions that are in there. there's the hallucinations that we've talked about. There's disorganized thinking, speech, and behavior. One of the things that are characterized a disorganized type person with schizophrenia is that their clothing won't make sense in a normal context. Like in the summer, you might see a person wearing like long pants, a long sleeve shirt, and a jacket, and like maybe a hat. They're dressed for winter in the summertime because they're to them, that's clothes. In their context, that's clothes, but it's not. But it's disorganized is all get out. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia that is there's a loss of interest in things that they enjoyed. Flattened affect. They don't show emotion. They might have catatonic type symptoms. There's a catatonic type schizophrenia where they either they don't talk, or they'll only say like one or two words, or they sit and stare. They have unnatural looking posture. Sometimes they'll go in circle patterns and all and things of that nature. But the most common type of schizophrenia is either paranoid or disorganized type. Catatonic is very rare.
Huh. Cool. Okay, in the meantime, Caleb, I know you said that you didn't want to be up at 1 o'clock in the morning. Like,
Yeah.
do you want to get out of here or what? Like,
yeah, here in a minute. Why? What's up?
I don't know. I just like wanted to make sure that you're, I don't know.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna take off in a minute, but
well, while we still have you here, I guess we can cover one more topic before we call it a night. And this is one that
yeah,
Caleb's not a big fan of, and this is, I think, in your wheelhouse, Jonathan, is cognitive ability and IQ. I've heard you guys have gone back and forth on that, and I know me and Caleb have gone back and forth.
So you want to start a fucking hour conversation?
No, but I
That's
mean,
the final hour.
I just want to know what it is about testing for IQ and cognitive ability. Why is it so controversial?
Okay. I figure like, I don't know. I'm this is one of those topics where like I know like a little bit about, but I don't know. I feel like I've already been over this with Caleb a bit, and like we've come to
a close agreement on it. I mean, dude, originally, like I was telling you about how Charles Murray, I mean, race and IQ, like the idea, there are problems with IQ tests where they say that certain races are inferior to other races because of the applications they've been applied to in the past in areas like the United States and stuff like that. Like, there have been nefarious reasons to label people with higher IQs than people with lower IQs. In reality, it was based on like their education or, you know, and anything all the way down to nutrition, you know, like, and I mean, we can debate on that if you want.
like,
but
I do feel like this would be a bit of an hour-long conversation, especially if you don't have like one specific topic. Personally, like, I'm not sure if.
But I guess the thing is that it's similar to in SAT. Now, the fundamental problem I have with it, just personally, is that I feel as though it's just like any other test. It's like an SAT test. It's something that if you show me pattern recognition on a test, like, you know, I took logic classes in college and stuff. If you give me like a set of data to remember or something, or a set of patterns to remember, I will get better and better at that the more I study it, and therefore my IQ test score will go up higher and higher. That doesn't mean that I get smarter and smarter.
Yeah.
That just means that I fucking studied.
So there are a couple like, so there are a couple, the reasons why a lot of like that rhetoric, I would say, well, I'm not dissing it or anything, I'm just trying to label it. The reason why that saying that doesn't necessarily make that much sense is because, well, like you wouldn't, the way
Are you
that
sure?
IQ tests are generally generated, like, is okay. So you could theorize like multiple intelligence. So it's like multiple different things people are good at and bad at, right? And different
It's like
things that people
learning.
have
It's like
different,
it's like
like
this.
maybe musical ability, like they're
It's
good
like
at like,
learning a new
well,
language. Like some people do it quicker and some people do it faster. Maybe they're the smarter ones, but if you learn the language and then you become fluent in it, then you get 100% score on the test on that language. Does that mean you're a genius, or does that mean you studied
okay,
more
so
and became fluent in that language?
So general IQ
you
test
could
is,
think of, all right, go ahead,
no, I
John.
was going to say general IQ test is just looking to see where a person's at, predicated on different cognitive tasks, whether it's reading comprehension, mathematical ability, verbal IQ, which is, your knowledge of words, or, how many words you know, or what difficult words you might know. But it's just to see where someone's at. It's typically used to see if there's like, any sort of intellectual disorder or disability that's present.
And that's perfectly fine. There's no problem with that. That is a good purpose for an IQ test. A bad purpose for an IQ test is to, say that black people are not as smart as white people.
So
Okay,
I don't
so I
think
can,
I don't think anybody ever actually
No,
says that.
no, lies, total lies, total lies. Let's not even pretend like that hasn't happened in history.
I'm just okay. So contemporary right now, in this time in place, nobody uses an IQ test to say that.
Well, no, nobody
I
really
would
uses
disagree with
IQ
that, like,
tests. Wait. Who the fuck uses IQ tests now?
Clinical psychologists and counselors will, especially when it comes to children.
What?
well, if, okay,
To see if
so
they're mentally retarded, right?
Well, that could be
can,
one thing. It could be, well, educators will even use IQ tests. Like if you have a gifted program.
To see if they're disabled, right?
No, to see if they're going to qualify for, say, a gifted program. Like, say you have an elementary school child, let's say they're in 4th or 5th grade. They're extremely intelligent and their cognitive ability is higher than that of their peers, so they're going to qualify for a program that's going to be more challenging for them.
okay,
But they
so
have to have a certain IQ to qualify for that.
I feel like there's going to be
So
an
it's
impasse
for,
here until we understand. I feel like there's going to be an impasse here until there's a basic like understanding of what IQ is, where it comes from, what the reasoning is behind those tests. So can I go into my
Go for it.
hypothesis okay. So Caleb,
Mhm.
imagine there are a lot of different things that people differ in skill at. Like say somebody learns a skill faster, right? Or not a skill, a sport faster. Like maybe some people are somewhat better at learning football, right? Like you could agree that there are those differences in people's ability to learn certain things, right? Like generally, roughly
Some
speaking.
people are smarter than other people. Yes.
Okay, so the way that IQ tests, like, it's not like somebody's just like hypothesizing something. This is something that comes from a lot of research. So generally, you get theorize a lot of different intelligences and a lot of different things that people have differing intelligences at, be it
Dude,
like musical
hold on.
ability,
Wait, I
bodily
gotta stop you
ability.
there. You're saying that you can give somebody an IQ test to see how smart they are, right? See how quick they are on
Not
their feet.
necessarily.
Dude, I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm saying if there are problems with the
Okay, so the
way the
reason
IQ
I'm
test has
trying
been
to
applied.
explain through like hypothesis through like some very like, I don't know, trying to give you
Very
an explanation
basic
of where
things.
IQ comes from. Yeah, like you can theorize a bunch
I
of,
I
okay, so
get
what
it.
I was saying, okay, So there are a lot of different things that people are good at. What happens when you measure all of those different things and you look at how good people are in terms of how fast they learn how to do music, how fast they learn how to do math, how fast they learn how to learn a language, how fast they can find logical errors, how fast they can react to a complex reaction time test. The reason why we have G is because if you look at all various different tasks, various mental abilities, they all have a tendency to correlate. So you end up with being able to measure by measuring one of those different things, you measure a lot of different things. So does that make sense
What
to you?
about, yeah,
like,
yeah,
you could-
yeah. What about the Flynn
Okay.
effect?
Okay, so the Flynn effect, like that's definitely a thing.
Yeah, it is.
We're dealing with there is, I do believe that some pieces of G or some pieces of IQ tests have a tendency to be very Flynn affected, whereas others don't. And so that might represent
Why?
like
Why?
educational. Well, if some things are rising, if some parts of IQ tests are rising and other parts aren't, and the parts that are rising are correlated to like learnable tasks, like maybe your logic abilities, your verbal abilities, stuff like that, then that would indicate that it's not necessarily people's innate intelligence going up, it's people's education going up. And so the intelligence would still stay the
Exactly.
same. The inner intelligence would stay the same in that,
Dude,
I don't know.
wait,
You know what I'm
wait.
saying.
Are we talking about the
No.
difference between fluid IQ and crystallized IQ? Because G, I think, is crystallized IQ. That's the thing that's your base
I think that
intelligence,
G
and
would
base
be
There's a
skill for things.
problem with, and there's a problem with
Right.
that. That changes with education.
But
That's
that's
what the
true.
Flynn effect
That's
is.
true of crystallized IQ or fluid IQ. But crystallized uses your base raw, what you've got going
Well,
for you.
that's what the Flynn effect explained, is that over time people got higher and higher IQ rates with
Yeah, but
different.
what you're trying to measure though isn't how educated people are. What you're trying to measure is how fast they can learn, which is even if people get more educated, you're still, that value of how quickly people can learn is still valuable. Like if you say nobody uses IQ tests, well, everybody uses SAT tests for the most part. And
I
SAT
know
has a
that.
really high correlation with IQ. And so basically like those are both trying to measure people's intelligence. And okay, I'm not
But
going to argue, like there are obvious like reasons why like people defer on IQ tests. That could be nutrition, that could be stress. I'm sure stress plays a decent role in terms of the black white IQ gap. There's something called stereotype bias. There's a lot of different things that would contribute to that.
and that's
And
why
all of
we
those
use
things are
And
problems.
there's a cultural aspect to that as well. There's a
and
reason why certain Jewish
Yeah, like
populations and Asian populations tend to score higher on IQ tests than everybody else. And
there's a reason.
that's because those cultures cultivate conscientiousness. They cultivate people who work hard, and it's like they're highly
there's
perfectionism is a part of that.
and there's a reason why we use SAT tests to get into college and not IQ tests too.
But those
Like,
are the same thing, though. That's the thing.
they're similar things. They're not the same thing.
Okay, so what
You know
how
that
exactly
they're
is
not
it
the
different?
same thing. Tell me how you're saying that the SAT is an IQ test?
Yeah, it correlates
It
really
is.
highly with IQ. And so
Wait,
basically,
so you've never taken an IQ test,
nope. Well, no, I have not.
dude?
But I know
It's what?
what's in an IQ
What?
test because
Why do
I've
you
studied.
worship the IQ test if you've never taken one?
Because the research holds up on its own. And
Take one. It's pattern recognition. That's all it is.
There's better
okay,
IQ.
that's
No,
wrong because
if you want a reliable IQ test, you want to take
Dude, go to college, take a logic
there's the
class.
Stanford Binet
It's pattern
intelligence scale, and
recognition.
then there's
No,
also the
wait.
Wechsler scales.
Wait, you can't just decide the IQ test is God and not have taken one.
why not? And
What?
also, I'm not
What do you
deciding that it's
mean, why
wrong.
not? Why would you think that the SAT
I
is
know
fucking perfect? I mean,
because you're talking about research has validated that the SAT and the IQ test
oh my God,
correlate
the
very
test
highly.
you fucking get wasted before you go to college shows how smart you are. Get the fuck out of here. Like, that's silly.
Okay, so can you repeat that? That
The
okay.
test you get fucking drunk before you go take to get into college, that shows how smart you are. Like, what I'm saying
Okay,
is you
so
can't
I'm trying to.
fundamentally explain you can't analyze intelligence perfectly. There's just no fucking way.
Okay, so I take issue. Okay, so I should be clear because, like, I intend to do things with my life. I don't want any of this things that some reporter digs up. I don't know. I don't want to
Dude,
misstate anything. I don't want to
After
be
15 years
misunderstood.
of work, here's an interesting thing. The yielding correlations between intelligence and the SAT is roughly that of 0.5 to 0.9, depending on the samples and the way in which intelligence is defined. So depending on how you define intelligence and which sample you go for, 0.9 is a pretty high correlation because the tightest correlation you can get is a 1.
I didn't
Yeah.
hear what you said.
Depending on this sample and how you define intelligence, the correlations between the SAT and, say, any sort of IQ test, whether it be the Stanford Binet or the Wechsler scales, typically the correlation is between 0.5 and 0.9. Now, 0.5 is the lowest
Okay.
correlation, but it's still a positive correlation. But the
Okay.
the closer you get to 1, you can't help but infer that there's going to be a tight possible causal correlation. That's usually around the 0.9, say 2 to 0.98. So
Okay.
if you're looking at samples of those who take the SATs and how they define intelligence, and you're having anywhere between a 0.6 to a 0.9 correlation, then the SATs can reflect IQ.
Okay.
From a
So
correlational standpoint, not that causation is not correlation.
dude, so basically what you're saying is the SAT is an IQ test.
There's correlations that you can basically hypothesize that if a person does really, really well on SAT, that they probably
will.
have a higher IQ than those who don't do very well. But the
Okay.
only way that you would be able to actually validate that hypothesis is to have them take either the Stanford Binet or the Wechsler scale.
And like I said to fucking Matt the other day, the SAT is just a baby bar exam. It is a baby fucking LSAT. That doesn't show, I don't think that shows raw intelligence.
Something, can you guys hear me? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. So when the reason why I say the SATs and IQ tests are both basically the same thing is
Well, then
because of the high
what's your
correlation. You're
dude?
basically
Wait,
measuring
wait,
between,
no,
right?
wait. You're telling me that from the beginning, your argument is that SATs prove how smart you are?
No, he said that
Okay, so
SATs.
No, wait. We've been talking about this for years. We've been talking about this for years. Dude, not like it's not like we just fucking like came out of this out of nowhere. We've been talking about this for years. I've been trying to tell him you can't tell. Like I tried to explain to him if we were both like living in the ghetto of fucking Harlem back in the 1920s, like it just because we can't pass an SAT score doesn't mean we're not intelligent or
okay,
whatever.
so can I say that, or can
Yeah.
I add on to that? So yes, I agree with that. If you have never taken an IQ, if you have never taken an SAT test, then yes, the SAT is not going to be a good measure of your intelligence because you're going to score remarkably, or you're going to score extremely low if you don't even know how to read. Yes, that is true. You're not going to be scoring very high on it. But when you're dealing with a population, when you're dealing with people who have been in school for 12 years or whatever, assuming that you basically you're measuring how good they do in relation to the rest of the population, or in regards to the rest of the school population. And so if you have a high IQ and you're a fast learner, that's the other thing, is that intelligence tends to correlate with how fast you learn. And so if you have been learning for the last if you have been learning fast, if you're a fast learner, then you're also like even okay. So a lot of the SAT things, like there are 13-year-olds. Well, I don't know. I haven't taken an SAT test, but from what I've heard from the likes of Richard Heyer, who is an intelligence researcher, neuroscientist. I don't know all the statistics. I'm really like to anyone listening, 40 years in the
No,
future, 20 years in the future. I don't know all the things.
you're
I'm
canceled,
17
Matt.
years-
You're canceled.
Yeah. I'm 17 years old. I don't necessarily know everything. I'm just trying to do this in a, I don't know, what do you call it? Sympathetic way. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Okay. So anyway, what
I'm
actually,
just
I
fucking with
naturally
you.
have things about IQ tests. Naturally have certain things you can measure that are not necessarily trainable. And that could be how fast you learn how to, I don't know, learn a new
Dude,
game,
wait,
learn a
wait,
brand
wait.
new game, learn
Can I say
reaction
something real quick?
time.
Like,
Okay, go
I
ahead.
I think I agree with you. See, that's the thing is I agree. I agree with you. It the only problem I've ever had with the IQ test is are with people like Charles Murray, people saying that you're inferior because you're black and you can't pass you have lower scores on this. Things like that without taking into account things like location, economic status, shit like that. Like that's the only problem, really. I mean, obviously, you know, demographics will vary.
And personality.
Yeah. So those things are truths. Like,
Okay.
and I'm not
So there's
denying those
actually other
truths.
things. IQ tests, well, there are certain things that you can think of which are easy to train. Like maybe you can get really good at like adding numbers or playing Tetris if you really train at. And like maybe some people are good at playing Tetris because they played for years. Other people are
Terrible at it. Yeah, I
because
see what you're saying.
they've
But it's
written
not
that.
gonna-
Like those things. So you can also
Now, I'm
like
not denying that some people are better at pattern recognition. I'm not denying that some
it's
people are
not just
better at
pattern recognition.
Tetris.
It's that
You
it's
know what
all
I'm
kind of
saying.
correlated. If you measure pattern recognition, you're also measuring verbal ability,
Yes.
mathematical ability. You're measuring a lot of different traits by
I,
by
what,
measuring pattern recognition. And
absolutely.
you also get reaction time, you get reasoning ability. A lot of these different things have a tendency to correlate. And so by measuring any one of those things, you're also measuring other things by the same thing. So anyways, what I was saying.
100%.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that if there are a lot of things in the IQ test that theoretically you could train for. Now, you could get better at them and whatnot.
You mean the SAT?
Yeah, there are certain elements of the SAT which are very trainable, I'm sure.
Well, you said they're the same thing, right?
Yeah, they are the same thing. But what I'm saying is, if you're dealing with a novel situation, then how fast you learn how to answer those things correctly, that's also going to correlate to intelligence, because intelligence is correlated to how fast you learn things, right? So if you learn something fast, that's going to be a measure of your intelligence as well. And what researchers have found is that intelligence correlates with both the how fast, or it correlates with how fast you do novel things, and it also correlates with how much you've learned. Like, for example, vocabulary has a tendency to correlate really highly with intelligence. Now, theoretically, you could imagine somebody who has never been around people who speak a lot, or maybe they don't use very big words, and that person might have a low vocabulary, but you can still, like, from what I know.
What if we get, wait, hold on. I want to say something. What if we gave somebody who could score a perfect score on the SAT, what if we gave them 10 grand every time they did it? How much do you think that would change the SAT scores?
Okay, so this is
It does. I don't see how that would, because all you're doing is you're basically, what you're doing is you're rewarding a person for taking a test.
But no, but I
well,
think that
I
people
would
would
comment that
figure
you
the
actually
test
do get
out.
rewarded.
I think they would figure the test out and fucking get their 10 grand.
But see, the SAT
Everyone
the
is
only
always
thing
going
it
to-
does is it measures a person's ability to take the SAT.
Oh,
If I
wait,
gave
you just sounded like Sam Cedar just now when he was talking about the
Well,
fucking IQ test.
so the GREs are the same thing. They test your ability to take the GRE, but people are going to score in certain percentiles, which compares
Dude.
their score to the other people that take the damn test. People
Okay.
that score higher on those tests, due to the correlations, you can infer that they have a higher IQ than someone who might score very low on that test. Studying for the test will only increase your ability to increase your score, maybe a standard deviation or two as far as that goes, because your
However,
processing and all of that is still going to be the same.
However, that's not true, because when you're taking an SAT test to get into college, you study before you do it. That's
Same thing with the GRE.
okay.
But you're
well,
still,
then
but you're,
what's
but
the
you're,
point?
but you're still, your base ability is still your base ability. That's that.
Okay, but if we give you 10 grand, if you make a perfect score,
So this
I
is
mean,
this is why I think the best way to test the hypothesis would be to have someone take a WACE and have someone take the SAT and see what the correlations between IQ and their score on the SAT is.
Yeah. Okay. So can I comment some things?
yeah.
Okay. So first of all, there's a pretty decent reward for doing well on an SAT. You get into a better college. People spend their lives
Absolutely.
wanting to do really good on SATs. So ideally, now we could definitely, like, I think that, I forget who did the research, but there was some research on motivation and IQ. Like I'm not sure how much or how relevant it is. Something like 7 to like 7 points I don't know exactly what it is. Forgive me. But ideally, when you're trying to measure somebody's ability on certain things, you're wanting to negate all the other factors. So I wouldn't. So and also another thing, when you're measuring somebody's IQ, you're not measuring it how good they do on the test itself. You're measuring how well they do in reference to the rest of the population. So if I was trying to measure how fast you learn, and I basically tested you with giving you inventing a completely new language, and I gave you some basic lessons in that language. Well, of course, that would relate to memory and whatnot, but how fast you learn, say, the grammar of that language. Say I gave you an hour time to study it, and I gave everybody in the study an hour to study it. And then I measured everyone's ability on how well they do at learning that new language, that completely new language. Then that would, I'm sure, correlate to somebody's language learning ability to some extent.
Dude,
right? And
like I
tell you
said, I
more
think
about
we
language in general.
I
Right?
think we get it. And like I said, the SAT is a baby LSAT, and the LSAT's a baby bar exam. Or same thing can go for the MCATs. Like they're just tests, but I just don't think they correlate with intelligence.
But
Well,
I
except
just
it's
read
mean,
the data
yeah,
that says that
it does
you can,
correlate with IQ, which correlates with a bunch of other things.
They-
That's objectively wrong.
Dude, what I'm saying is, yeah, they can tell they can tell certain things about you, like they can show whether you're competent or whatever, or a fairly smart person, but like as far as raw intelligence, I just don't think there's any way to show that.
there is. It's
Because
called the WAIS. It's the Westler Adult Intelligence Scale. It measures your verbal comprehension, your working memory, your perceptual operation, and your processing speed.
Okay,
right,
so
but if you were raised without being taught how to read, sort of like a lot of you know, black communities or
You said there's
whatever
no
the
way to
fuck.
measure IQ, and I just gave you the test that measures IQ and the 4 domains of which which factors into it.
What
Okay.
test? Like what are you talking about?
It's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. It's the way
The what?
the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. They test for verbal comprehension, working memory index, your perceptual operation index, and your processing speed index. So your verbal comprehension and working memory goes into your verbal IQ, whereas your perceptual operation and processing speed goes into your performance IQ. You get your verbal IQ and your performance IQ put together and gives you a full scale IQ raw score.
So we
Okay,
can tell
so
how smart everybody is.
It,
Right?
it tells
can I add 2 things,
it
please?
measures your verbal IQ and your performance IQ. It gives you a raw
Okay.
IQ score and tells you where you're at regarding your intelligence quotient compared to other people in the sample population that have taken the weights.
Okay, so can we use that to decide like things about society, like who's smart enough and who's not smart enough, things like that?
Okay,
Well,
so can I
I've told you what
like
it's used
add
for.
stuff?
I couldn't hear you guys.
Can you hear
What?
me all right? Okay.
Yep.
So there are some things that I wanted to add. So first of all, most intelligence researchers, intelligence researchers, they don't necessarily agree with the idea of the G factor and IQ necessarily measuring intelligence. It's merely measuring an aspect of intelligence, which tends to be fairly decent, but nobody's claiming that that is the entire intelligence. Like you could theoretically, and there is some studies in
Okay.
regards to like things
Okay.
that are slightly outside of the G factor.
Okay,
So
and
like
that's fine.
we
And
shouldn't
that's
be,
fine. That's completely fine. And you know, as long as it's not used to you know, like say black people are inferior or whatever. And also you gotta remember the Flynn effect, right?
yeah. So again,
but
can I go back to another piece or another
what?
thing? Can
Yeah.
I go back to another thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so back to my language Klingon example, like I still have another aspect to do. So if you make up a new language and you give it to a bunch of study participants and you give them 1 hour to
Mhm.
study this language and try to figure out all the grammar of it, and
Mhm.
then you test them after 1 hour and you figure out how well they did at learning that language, then that's going to be maybe a rough measure of everyone's language learning ability. But then if you take
Mhm.
any one person out and you let them study for 10 hours, then you like say, oh yeah, this is a teachable skill. Well, not necessarily, because you're not measuring somebody's language learning ability. You're measuring like, obviously, like that score is going to be way off. Like just
Yeah.
because you can study for that test doesn't necessarily
Uh-huh.
mean that it's validating the measurement, because in some sense the measurement
Well,
is
I agree with you.
okay.
No, I agree with that. I guess what I'm saying is that if somebody is if somebody has never been open to those opportunities, they that doesn't equal lower intelligence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
Like
would absolutely agree with that. Like
I'm
you
not
can't
saying
take an SAT. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm just saying that like I get what you're saying. That if we were sitting here and we're like, how do we open this can or whatever? Like we figure it out. But if somebody had never been shown a can opener in their entire life or whatever, it, if if somebody is not in the same environment as you are in, how can you expect to determine the difference between you and that other person?
Yeah.
And
Okay. So I
to
would agree
call
with
it the
that.
same thing. Yeah. And that's all
Okay.
I'm
So
saying. All I'm saying.
and that's perfectly legitimate argument, but it doesn't invalidate IQ tests for a given reason. I can't take an SAT and go and give it to a, what do you call it? Say like a pygmy person in Africa, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of like to the Aboriginal population.
Okay,
I
okay,
can't
well,
do that
I'm
because naturally they haven't. There, it's not,
the
wouldn't then be measuring intelligence. It would be measuring nothing because
the differences don't have to be that extreme. The differences could literally be a poor school versus a rich school, a prep school versus a school in the ghetto. You don't think
okay.
there's going to
So
be differences there?
the issue with that argument is there are certain things that are really, really hard to train people in, and they reflect innate ability to a certain extent. Like, for example, with reaction time, with like CS:GO, people know this, various other people. This is mainstream in a lot of sports, but you cannot change reaction time by more than like 20%, by like 15 to 20%, I've heard. And I might be
Okay.
wrong about that, so you can
Mhm.
correct me if I'm incorrect.
No, you're not.
So that if you measure that in a population of normal, nutritional, healthy people, you're going to get a representation of that person's reaction time. Because, okay, where's my argument? And the fact is that that reaction time will correlate to a lot of different factors in, gosh, I got lost. Anyways,
Go ahead.
starting from the beginning, there's a lot of things, like for example, SAT scores. You can't if you put in like 300 hours into studying for SATs, you can
Yeah.
get like a 100-point advantage in general. But after that point, it is incredibly difficult to get better
Uh,
SATs. Now, theoretically,
Now
if you
that
wanted to
might
get
be
a better
true.
measure,
I'm not saying that's not true or anything.
now that would indicate, if now theoretically, if you wanted a perfect estimate of IQ, or a much better estimate of IQ from SAT scores, you would give everybody that much training, and then you would basically get everybody to the point where it starts to peter out, to the point where you can't then increase it anymore. And then that score that they get is going to be a representation of how innately intelligent they are, because I
Okay.
don't know, you know
All
what I'm
right.
saying.
Okay. I think I do. And I think these are all reasonable arguments. Okay, so this is kind of the defining question. Do you think that races are smarter than other races?
No,
It
I don't
depends.
think
It
that
depends on the cultural context.
Okay, in America, do you think blacks are smarter than whites? Or whites are smarter than blacks?
Okay, so if you look at like maybe
Just
test
it's a
scores
yes or no
exactly,
question.
okay, if you look at the test scores exactly, then it does seem to indicate that. But of course,
That
that has
blacks are
explanation
smarter than whites or
outside
whites are smarter than blacks.
but that does have that does have reasons,
Wait,
and it does have.
cut through all the bullshit. Are
Okay,
whites smarter than
I'm trying to
blacks
be.
or are blacks smarter than whites?
I see no reason that would be that there would be a genetic reason for that. Now, it might be true, and it has been proven that there is a test score gap, but there's no reason that I am aware of that would indicate an actual gap in between the potentials of different people, because obviously you have these communities which are suppressed by education, by stress, by various cultural reasons. There's no, you understand what I'm saying. I'm sure you agree with it. Like,
Yeah. Okay. Well, what do
so
you
that's
think, Sean? Are blacks smarter than whites or whites smarter than blacks? Asians?
I think.
Whatever.
I think Jonathan summed up that argument perfectly. That there are going to be test gaps between different groups of people, but you have to say why that happens.
Okay, which ones are the smartest?
If you're looking at the raw
I
data
think
if you're looking at the raw data from the test scores, Asians and the Anasazi Jews tend to score higher than other
Ashkenazi.
races.
Yeah.
Than other that, but we also know that their cultures cultivate hard work and conscientiousness, and they put a high value on that. So that's one
okay,
reason
so
why that happens. We do know there's cultural differences between whites and blacks as far as how they value education on some degree. Like there have been instances, and this is documented in the social psychological literature, that some blacks look at other people within their in group, that if they do want to succeed, work hard, and go to
So
school,
blacks are at the bottom of the totem
that's
pole.
not what I said. What I
What,
said,
what are you saying? What
what
are
I'm
you
saying,
saying?
if you look at the social psychological literature, there is a bias against acting white amongst African Americans and their attitudes toward education with other members of their in group.
Okay, so I got another thing
What-
to add real quick.
What races? How are they listed? Like Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, whites, blacks? Is that how it's going? The stereotypical thing that everybody believes.
That's what
Generally-
the raw data
generally
shows,
Ashkenazi
but there's
Jews-
reasons for it.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, I would say that
well,
there's reasons
so-
for it.
So you confirmed what I said.
Yeah, and like
Okay.
it depends on what
So-
exactly.
What?
part of you-
Asians, Ashkenazi Jews, whites, blacks, and whatever after that, right?
Okay, like I don't like see like I don't like the whole pyramid structure of that. It's sort of like
Well, you're the one that's
also
filing it that way.
No, we're saying that that's what the data indicates, but we're also saying why
Okay,
the
that's
data
what the
indicates
data
that way.
indicates.
but you're also he doesn't I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit gross to put it
It
that way
is.
because you also
It
are
is.
dealing with standard distributions, and you're basically having all these different standard distributions line up so that there's a whole lot of overlap between each of those different gaps. Or
Kind of my
you're not just dealing with-
problem in the first place.
okay, so there's another thing that I am really curious about. I know that that there are I wonder how much of various test score gaps, be it educational gaps, stuff like that. I wonder how much of those gaps are basically if you put a white person in a black community, is it an effect of racism, or is it just an effect of is it
I
is it an effect of
wonder,
racism or
yeah, I
geography?
wonder
So,
if culture had anything to do with that.
That's what I was trying to get at, right?
I bet your ass it did.
yeah,
I mean,
bet
dude,
there's,
that's
Why are you having this visceral emotional reaction to this? We're
Because-
not sitting here saying that any race is better than any other. We're looking at raw data, looking at the differences from a vast
okay.
majority of the population and where they group out, and we're trying to figure out why that happens.
Well,
You're having this visceral emotional reaction to just
I'll tell you-
what the data
I'll tell you why.
is.
I'll tell you
But
what.
you're not listening to what we're saying as to why it happens.
No, you're not telling me why it happens, dude. I'm telling you why it happens because of cultural differences, and those
Yeah.
cultural differences are not factored in. And that's
Okay,
the
I
problem
would
with
very
that's the problem
strongly-
with people like Charles Murray is they don't factor that in, and then they
Okay,
claim
so,
that
Caleb,
other races are more
But
superior.
we're not. But me and Jonathan aren't making that claim.
Okay, so
So
I've
basically, you're
got
saying that it's a wash.
okay, so I got something to point out, and that is okay. So first of all, I think it's I see no reason to think that the black white IQ gap, though it exists, that it is genetic. I see no evidence of that it's anything other than culture, geography, racism, various other factors, stereotype bias, stress, motivation. You could think of a lot of different reasons for it. Another thing, okay, so that's my first thing. My second thing is, okay, so back when I was I don't know, what do you call it? A bit of a crazy, I don't know, 14-year-old, I actually read the bell curve. And while it perhaps isn't the best account of say class and race and IQ that is around, I don't think that it is nearly as racist as you say. Most IQ researchers do understand that culture plays a role, and you can
This
actually
is why I
quantify.
get screwed.
You
This
can
is why.
quantify in terms of
This is why.
research. You can research how much of a difference things like culture and background, education, all of these things are quantifiable
And
in terms
personality
of their
too,
influence
because
on IQ. Yeah,
conscientious
exactly.
So it has nothing to do with their like culture. It's their skin color that makes
No,
their.
dude.
What
But
are you
it,
talking
It's a black
about?
and white fallacy.
he basically said, Jonathan, if I get this wrong, point out where I get this wrong, but basically Jonathan said that there's no genetic reason why that there's the gap. What that means that it has nothing to do with skin color. There's nothing genetic about that.
No, he's saying the
You might have
opposite.
some biological differences. If someone's got like an intellectual disability, then yeah, they're going to get lumped in on the lower end of the belt of the standard deviation. They're going to be an outlier toward the negative rather than the positive.
Is that what you're saying, Jonathan?
Okay, so
What? See, that's not what he's saying.
okay,
Don't
so
treat me like I'm fucking wrong.
dude,
He's
dude,
saying that it does matter.
Who's
that what
he?
matter? I'm very confused. Oh, my thing froze. Okay, are you back?
He's
Oh.
frozen at the moment, but there's no genetic reason why, other than unless there's a biological reason for an intellectual disability why someone would be on the negative end of the distribution.
Yeah, and even if it was, yeah, like a lot of the times, just because somebody is more or less intelligent, that doesn't put like an actual. That's just a. That isn't a fact about their character. It's not a fact about how nice of a like. It's just
It's
an
just that they're
unfortunate fact.
dumb.
Dude, I don't get how I can say something and try. I'm trying to be as
Nice.
I'm trying to add something on that's really important, and that is that IQ
You're
is not a
trying to
credit score.
say
You're not a good
that
person if you have a
that
high IQ.
wait
You're not
wait
a
wait
bad
wait wait a
person if you have a low
wait
one.
a second. Are you trying to say that races are different intelligences, like that they're each on different levels? Is
I
that
would
what you're
say
saying?
I think
No,
culture.
No,
I'm
wait.
just
I
okay.
want to hear his answer. Do you
Okay,
think
so
based? Wait, hold on. Do you think based on race that your intelligence level may vary just based
okay,
on your race? Just
so I'm
answer
gonna
yes
say
or
the
no,
most controversial thing of the night.
dude. Just yes or no. Based on
Yes,
your
there
race,
are differences in intelligence on
yes
G
on
of the
race.
differences.
Just
Generally,
based on
I
your
don't think
race.
that
Sean, I rest my
no,
case.
not based on race, not
So
based.
So
Caleb, I have a
Okay,
problem with
so
your question formulation. You're not being precise enough. Are you talking?
I'm
Are you,
asking if you're black
so just
or
because
does
Asian,
it have? Are
something
you talking basically?
dude.
Are you specifically specifying the melanin levels of someone's skin? Or are you talking about the cultural differences that?
yeah, you can
No,
have cultural differences that are
based
because
I'm
uh
saying your skin color.
So
Based
you're
on your
talking
skin color,
specifically melanin.
are you
okay. I don't know if you can still hear me, but
I can still hear you.
okay. For the listeners, I would say that you have differences that are between the quote unquote races, ethnicities. Forget my verbiage, I'm not very good at it.
It's fine.
You do have differences, but that doesn't mean that those differences are genetic. It doesn't mean that, and I would argue that they are probably caused by culture, by geography, by a thousand different other
Well, yeah,
factors. It
there's
doesn't.
so many there. You have to say you have to say that there are going to be variables that are going to affect the data.
Yeah,
Nobody
like
disputes that, and there's nothing racist about that. There's nothing biased about that. There's nothing prejudiced about that. Because what you're
yeah,
doing is you're basically you're looking at ethnicity or race, right? And you're looking at where they're clumped at within the standard distribution.
yeah,
So for anybody that's watching this or listening to this, so the bell curve, basically that's a standard distribution. All of your averages typically line up in the middle of the distribution. So that's where your averages are. That's going to be under that bell. And then the outsides of that, of course, are the outliers. You're going to have outliers that are going to score extremely high by like 3 or 4 standard deviations, and you're going to have people that are going to score very low at the negative end of the distribution. Cultural differences do make a difference. Asian culture, they're very conscientious, they're very hardworking, they're more geared toward individual success, and they also they cultivate that, so they're going to score higher in if you look at the averages, Asians tend to score higher in IQ. Same thing with Ashkenazi Jews, and it's because their culture is predicated on cultivating, successful people. And if you're going to predict success in any given domain, IQ is one of the best predictors next to conscientiousness. And I don't know if you're familiar with the third psychometric, but it's called grit. And that was something that Dr. Angela Duckworth figured out, that grit also predicts success. Not as it's up there with conscientiousness, but still IQ is the #1 predictor. And what I was trying to explain to Caleb, and he flipped out on me, is that, it's been documented in the social psychological literature that among African Americans, they tend to look down on their fellow African American members of their in-group if a person wants to be more educated or to break away from that stereotype. They call it like acting white, and I'm not making this stuff up.
Yeah, I think that it's like it's fairly mainstream for that to be understood. Like, I don't know. I think that like I really like I take issue with the agnosticism around testing and around basically all like measurement in psychology, because it's just so like closed-minded. It's not about actually finding solutions to measurement. It's just about like saying that you can, and like they're generally, like I've said this before in
I don't understand the emotional the gut, like the visceral emotional reaction to just the data. As a scientist, you're just saying, as scientists, we're saying this is what this indicates, right?
Yeah.
So you have this raw data, and it indicates this. So the next question is, well, why is it that this happens? Why is this distribution like this? And this is where you have to look at all the factors, like you said: geography, stress, anxiety disorders. People with anxiety disorders tend to score lower on any sort of whether it's an educational test, whether it's an assessment of any sort. They're going to have problems. You have intellectual disability / disorder. You have poor nutrition, which is going to have a detriment on, say, brain development. So then your performance, IQ, and all of that's going to be affected. Cultural differences. If you come from a culture where success and hard work and intelligence is highly valued, they're going to instill that in you, and so you're going to score higher on assessments that assess IQ. If you come from a culture where, let's say, it's looked down upon because it doesn't fit, say, the main what that in-group values, because I think from what I understand from taking multicultural counseling, is African Americans, they're more family oriented. They're more identity centered because due to our unfortunately complicated and terrible history with slavery. So there are some documented there's documented evidence in the social psychological literature that some Black people typically tend to look at any other Black person that tries to be more educated and be more successful as being a race traitor or trying to act white. These things have been documented. It's documented in the literature on bullying in middle school and high school. I'm not making this up.
Yeah, I believe that, or I've heard that from. Gosh, I forget. Would I be wrong in guessing that? I don't know. I heard that. I've heard that a lot of times, and I don't know. Another thing that I found really interesting is Well, when you're talking about differences between ethnic categories, how they score on certain things, how they do on certain metrics, I wonder, like, you can easily, like, if I was to find a way to categorize people who lived in, say, very what do you call it, rundown neighborhoods, and people who lived in high society neighborhoods, like, I don't know if you do that through probably money.
You would do
You
it by
probably,
socioeconomic class. You would
yeah,
probably
so
look at it for you.
socioeconomic status, yeah. I
You would look
wonder,
at
like, how much I've heard some things about, say, socioeconomic status of, say, uh African Americans, that in some ways that a lot of the effects can go away once you adjust for the fact that a lot of African Americans live in the South. They live in low money neighborhoods. I wonder how much of the effect is racism, or whether or not it's just so quote unquote systemic racism, in terms of, like, if you were to put a white person in a black community, in an average black community, and trace their whether or not they would have the uh same results at the end of the day, or whether or not.
the only way to answer that question would be to run the experiment. We could make hypotheses right now. We
Like,
could hypothesize that if you put a white person in, say, a low socioeconomic neighborhood that is predominantly African American, you could hypothesize that they might score lower on an IQ test. And if that were to
yeah,
be the
like, I
case,
wonder if, like, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, I mean, if that's the case, then you could make the argument that racism doesn't play a part in that.
Yeah, I
And
like
it's
I
and there are black people that do live in higher socioeconomic areas, and they do tend to score higher than, say, their lower socioeconomic counterparts. Is it a consequence of racism? Is it a consequence of, access to more resources? These are the types of questions that really need to be asked, instead of having these irrational emotional reactions to just the raw data.
I don't think that, like, anytime, like, even if you were to take the worst, most racist, like, view of the data, like, possible, you still couldn't come to the conclusion that, say, African Americans are choosing to be terrible people. Say,
No,
okay, that sounds wrong. Even if, say, a certain ethnic group was proven to, like, be more violent by nature, more aggressive, less able to make social bonds, less intelligent. You could come up with any of those things. That still wouldn't be a statement on, like, in my opinion, that wouldn't be a statement on how good or bad they are, because a lot of these things you're dealing with, when in terms of, like, aggression, a lot of the things are not in a person's free choice. Like, certain people are
well,
more not
aggression is the
necessarily.
norm. There was
Yeah,
there's a gentleman whose name I can't remember, but he wrote a lot of scientific papers because he studied
Mark,
human aggression, and
yeah,
human aggression is the norm. The
yeah,
most
for sure.
aggressive human beings are 2-year-olds.
Hmm.
It's through
Yeah,
socialization.
I
It's
think
through
you just
social.
had a podcast with him a little bit ago, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I went and read some of the scientific papers, and so human aggression is the norm. Aggression decreases as a result of socialization. We also know that from the psychological literature, one of the major problems is that, and this goes for any ethnicity. If you have
Yeah.
two parents in the home, you're less likely to have antisocial personality, engage in antisocial and aggressive behaviors compared to a single parent home.
Yeah.
We also know that from the data that if you live in an area where there's less violence and less of those other factors, that antisocial behaviors also is also at a decreased risk, and the same thing for aggressive behavior. or if you're in a place where there's a lot of violence around, then you're going to see an increased risk for antisocial and aggressive behavior in people, as opposed to those who live in areas where that's not the case. Then of course,
Yeah.
decreased risk. Okay, that's not based on any racist presupposition. That's just what the data indicates, and it's predicated on that. So that's why when I hear the arguments about, well, same sex couples shouldn't adopt. It's like, well, no, that's wrong because two parents in the home are better than one. Like the data on that is very clear. And so now we don't know what the effects are as far as like, the lack of a female or the lack of a male role model in the home, but that's neither here nor there. There's not enough data out there to say one way or the other. I think their research is still ongoing.
Yeah, people have a tendency to find role models, I would say, in general. Like, it's really, yeah, you're right. The data is ongoing. I should leave it at that. Anyways, what I was saying is, even if you, like, in my estimation, and like, I don't know what your ideas on free will are. Like, could I ask you briefly about that? Like, what do you think of free will?
I think free will, I think there is an argument for and against it. We do have biological tendencies that tend to tilt us toward making certain decisions. So there is a bit of biological determinism that is in play. And then, of course, that's predicated on like how agreeable or how conscientious or how neurotic or extroverted you might be. I don't think openness really plays too much of a role in that.
Yeah.
Now, I would say that there are instances where we do have full free will, and that's how you react to certain situations. Now, you might have a biological tendency, let's say if you're high in neuroticism, and let's say you're high in aspect volatility, then you might be more irritable and easier to anger over minute things. But you can learn to undo that initial reaction through, exercises in radical acceptance, or, the SSTA method in problem solving therapy, stop, slow down, think, and then act. You can kind of stop and pump the brakes and slow down and really think about something and then reappraise the situation and react differently. So you do have a choice in that. So I think it's both. I think you tend to rush into error if you try to say full on 100% free will or full on 100% no free will.
Yeah,
I think you have to take it.
Like a lot of the nuances in a later podcast, but
Yes.
we both agree on like biological determinism on some things. Well, okay, so that there is some biological determinism. Like, say if you have major head trauma, that you're not necessarily going to have a choice in how you react to certain situations.
True.
A lot of the times, right? Like maybe if you're an extremely neurotic person, then you're going to react negatively to stress, and you don't necessarily have a choice in that, right? Or maybe like aggression. Like if you have a you have like a tumor in your amygdala, then you're not necessarily going to have quite the same choice as other things. And so like, even if you were to say that people were more aggressive, had a lot of these different traits that you would generally associate with bad people, they still wouldn't necessarily have a choice in those things. Now, that wouldn't necessarily reflect how good of a person they are, because they're also dealing with different things impacting how they make their choices, and right. So you would generally agree with that a lot of it.
I would agree with most of that. Like I said, there are some nuances where you can train people to change that, but
yeah, for sure.
That's through intensive psychotherapy.
Crazy psychotic household, then you shouldn't be, well, you might be able to be held to the same standard, but we wouldn't necessarily say that you're a bad person for, I don't know, being a little bit manipulative, for having some manipulative tendencies when it comes to that you're not quite aware of. You wouldn't say that, well, okay. You wouldn't say that you're a bad person if you grow up in the most psychotic of households. If you, when you were a teenager, had some psychotic tendencies, right? You would generally say that that's somewhat understandable, correct? Yeah. So I wouldn't say that a lot of the time it's not a statement on somebody's internal character if they do some bad things because they have had bad like upbringings, like to some extent their responsibility can be negated in that.
Well, yeah, it's like, okay, for
Punishment.
example, where I work in the maximum security unit, most of the guys that I work with are decent people. It's just they decided that neither they decided they didn't need their medication anymore, or they had a psychotic episode, or they had a severely manic episode with psychotic features, and let's say that because they had grandiose delusions or had hallucinations or command hallucinations, which are the voices that tell you to do things, and then they kill somebody. Once they're medicated and going through the process, they're really good people, you know.
Yeah.
And so, for me, a person's not the sum total of whatever it is that they're charged with. It's unfortunate that
Yeah.
it happened, but that's part of that random element to life or to existence. And
Mhm.
so, that it's, what do you do about that other than, okay, well, yeah, this happened and you're here and this sucks, but what can you take away from this that's going to be valuable to you, so that way you can recover, you can get back out of the community, you can get your life back, and you can be your own person. And that's the most important thing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I don't know. I figure we probably best wrap it up in a little bit, and then
Yeah,
'cause-
we can call it good right here, actually, if you
okay,
want.
I got one more like finishing statement.
Okay.
About like probably okay. So because like I don't know, I want to make sure that like if there is anyone listening down the road or whatever to this conversation, um, I am interested in intelligence, not because I want to look down on anyone for having a lower intelligence, for being less gifted in certain areas. I really am interested in it so that I can start to so I can understand it, so that I can help create systems which help us escape from the position where we are subject to our innate intelligence. So theoretically, that can be done through increasing intelligence in some way, through um, I don't know, some way like that. That's why I'm interested in it, not because I'm a racist, not because I'm interested in looking down on people.
Well,
Anyways, so
I think that's a noble thing, because as far as the data and everything shows as it is right now, there's no, if you have, let's say, low cognitive ability or low IQ, there's really nothing you can do about that. Yeah, you can extend out your crystallized IQ, but as far, or your fluid IQ, but as far as crystallized IQ, or the G factor, I think you've called it, we don't know what to do about that. And Peterson's talked about this in his lectures, that yeah, there's all these games and things that say that they can help you increase your IQ, but they absolutely don't, and the data on that is clear. So by understanding intelligence, then maybe we can actually come up with interventions that will actually work.
yeah, like Richard Heyer, I'm a huge fan of Richard Heyer. Well, so far, as far as I know him, he might be like a closeted, like have a Nazi flag up in his closet, but I don't know. So far, as far as I know him, as far as I know of his work, he's always been. He's also interested in IQ. I would recommend going if all three listeners go and I don't know, look, see what he's doing for interesting for understanding IQ. I'm with him, and like hopefully we can increase it through various like for example, this is a really interesting thing. Most of the difference between humans and chimpanzees. Okay, so there are a couple things that relate to hair growth. There are a couple things that relate to skeletal system, but when it comes to genes that relate to the brain, most of that has to do with how many times your neurons replicate. So it's basically like how large your brain grows. That's the main difference between chimpanzees and humans. And maybe we could bring that out further in the future to theoretically increase G beyond what's normally beyond even the normal human, like the most intelligent person you can dream of, or the most intelligent person that has been alive. Could theoretically we could create somebody, or not create, but we could
There'd be
maybe
interventions that would help
cause
get somebody to be
yeah,
on that level, if
somebody
not
to be
surpass it.
even, yeah, exactly. And we could do a lot of cool things in that. Another really cool thing, Robert Sapolsky's human behavioral biology really did a really good job in dissecting like all these areas where we think we have choice, but or where we think that we're better than the criminals, but really a lot of the times the criminals, they have factors that take away their free choice, so to speak. So anyways, that's all I gotta say.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I really had a lot of fun.
I enjoyed our conversations, and it was really
I
nice to
look
get
forward
to hear your voice and get to actually know you beyond just messaging on
Yeah,
social
nice
media.
to meet you as well. I gotta go check on Caleb probably, but
All right.
maybe next time I swear I'll do. I'm normally not this disorganized and
Oh
whatnot.
no,
And
it's perfectly fine. A lot of people aren't used to just a free, open-ended format.
conversation, yeah. I look forward to it. It's a good opportunity for me as a antisocial, I don't know, person to be able to learn how to speak in a way that in a communicate well. Anyways, thank you so much.
Oh,
I really appreciate it.
thank you for
Had a
coming
lot of
on.
fun. All right. Well, good night then.
Good
And you
night.
enjoy the rest of your night.
Yes, sir. And you have a good night too.
All right. See ya.